Chapter 3. Conversations and Exhortations of Father Zosima. E. The Russian Monk, and his possible significance. Fathers and teachers, what is the monk? In the cultivated world, the word is nowadays pronounced by some people with a jeer, and by others it is used as a term of abuse, and this contempt for the monk is growing. It is true, alas, it is true that there are many sluggards, gluttons, profligates, and insolent beggars among monks. Educated people point to these. You are idlers, useless members of society. You live on the labour of others. You are shameless beggars. And yet, how many meek and humble monks there are, yearning for solitude and fervent prayer in peace. These are less noticed or passed over in silence. And how surprised men would be if I were to say that from these meek monks who yearn for solitary prayer, the salvation of Russia will come perhaps once more, for they are in truth made ready in peace and quiet for the day and the hour, the month and the year. Meanwhile, in their solitude they keep the image of Christ fair and undefiled, in the purity of God's truth, from the times of the fathers of old, the apostles and the martyrs. And when the time comes they will show it to the tottering creeds of the world. That is a great thought. That star will rise out of the east. That is my view of the monk, and is it false? Is it too proud? Look at the worldly and all who set themselves up above the people of God. Has not God's image and his truth been distorted in them? They have science, but in science there is nothing but what is the object of sense. The spiritual world, the higher part of man's being, is rejected altogether, dismissed with a sort of triumph, even with hatred. The world has proclaimed the reign of freedom, especially of late, but what do we see in this freedom of theirs? Nothing but slavery and self-destruction. For the world says, you have desires and so satisfy them, for you have the same rights as the most rich and powerful. Don't be afraid of satisfying them and even multiplying your desires. That is the modern doctrine of the world. In that they see freedom, and what follows from this right of multiplication of desires? In the rich, isolation and spiritual suicide. In the poor, envy and murder, for they have been given rights, but they have not been shown the means of satisfying their wants. They maintain that the world is getting more and more united, more and more bound together in brotherly community, as it overcomes distance and sets thoughts flying through the air. Alas, put no faith in such a bond of union. Interpreting freedom as the multiplication and rapid satisfaction of desires, men distort their own nature. For many senseless and foolish desires and habits and ridiculous fancies are fostered in them. They live only for mutual envy, for luxury and ostentation, to have dinners, visits, carriages, rank, and slaves to wait on one, is looked upon as a necessity, for which life, honour, and human feeling are sacrificed, and men even commit suicide if they are unable to satisfy it. We see the same thing among those who are not rich, while the poor drown their unsatisfied need and their envy in drunkenness. But soon they will drink blood instead of wine, their being led on to it. I ask you, is such a man free? I knew one, champion of freedom, who told me himself that when he was deprived of tobacco in prison, he was so wretched at the privation that he almost went and betrayed his cause for the sake of getting tobacco again. And such a man says, I'm fighting for the cause of humanity. How can such a one fight? What is he fit for? He is capable perhaps of some action quickly over, but he cannot hold out long. And it's no wonder that instead of gaining freedom they have sunk into slavery, and instead of serving the cause of brotherly love and the union of humanity, have fallen, on the contrary, into dissension and isolation, as my mysterious visitor and teacher said to me in my youth. And therefore the idea of the service of humanity, of brotherly love and the solidarity of mankind, is more and more dying out in the world. And indeed this idea is sometimes treated with derision, for For how can a man shake off his habits? What can become of him if he is in such bondage to the habit of satisfying the innumerable desires he has created for himself? He is isolated, and what concern has he with the rest of humanity? They have succeeded in accumulating a greater mass of objects, but the joy in the world has grown less. The monastic way is very different. Obedience, fasting, and prayer are laughed at, yet only through them lies the way to real, true freedom. I cut off my superfluous and unnecessary desires. I subdue my proud and wanton will, and chastise it with obedience. And with God's help I attain freedom of spirit, and with it spiritual joy. Which is most capable of conceiving a great idea and serving it, the rich man in his isolation, or the man who has freed himself from the tyranny of material things and habits? The monk is reproached for his solitude. You have secluded yourself within the walls of the monastery for your own salvation, and have forgotten the brotherly service of humanity. But we shall see which will be most zealous in the cause of brotherly love. For it is not we, but they, who are in isolation, though they don't see that. Of old, leaders of the people came from among us, and why should they not again? The same meek and humble ascetics will rise up and go out to work for the great cause. The salvation of Russia comes from the people, and the Russian monk has always been on the side of the people. We are isolated only if the people are isolated. The people believe as we do, and an unbelieving reformer will never do anything in Russia, even if he is sincere in heart and a genius. Remember that. The people will meet the atheist and overcome him, and Russia will be one and orthodox. Take care of the peasant and guard his heart. Go on educating him quietly. That's your duty as monks, for the peasant has God in his heart. F. Of masters and servants, and of whether it is possible for them to be brothers in the spirit. Of course, I don't deny that there is sin in the peasants too, and the fire of corruption is spreading visibly, hourly, working from above downwards. The spirit of isolation is coming upon the people too. Money-lenders and devourers of the commune are rising up. Already the merchant grows more and more eager for rank, and strives to show himself cultured, though he has not a trace of culture, and to this end meanly despises his old traditions, and is even ashamed of the faith of his fathers. He visits princes, though he is only a peasant corrupted. The peasants are rotting in drunkenness and cannot shake off the habit, and what cruelty to their wives, to their children even, all from drunkenness. I've seen in the factories children of 9 years old, frail, rickety, bent, and already depraved. The stuffy workshop, the din of machinery, work all day long, the vile language and the drink. The drink, is that what a little child's heart needs? He needs sunshine, childish play, good examples all about him, and at least a little love. There must be no more of this. Monks, or more torturing of children, rise up and preach that. Make haste, make haste. But God will save Russia, for though the peasants are corrupted and cannot renounce their filthy sin, yet they know it is cursed by God, and that they do wrong in sinning, so that our people still believe in righteousness, have faith in God, and weep tears of devotion. It is different with the upper classes. They, following science, want to base justice on reason alone, but not with Christ, as before, and they have already proclaimed that there is no crime, that there is no sin. And that's consistent, for if you have no God, what is the meaning of crime? In Europe, the people are already rising up against the rich with violence, and the leaders of the people are everywhere leading them to bloodshed, and teaching them that their wrath is righteous. But their wrath is accursed, for it is cruel. But God will save Russia, as he has saved her many times. Salvation will come from the people, from their faith and their meekness. Fathers and teachers, watch over the people's faith, and this will not be a dream. I've been struck all my life in our great people by their dignity, their true and seemly dignity. I've seen it myself, I can testify to it. I've seen it and marvelled at it. I've seen it in spite of the degraded sins and poverty-stricken appearance of our peasantry. They are not servile, and even after 2 centuries of serfdom they are free in manner and bearing, yet without insolence, and not revengeful, and not envious. You are rich and noble, you are clever and talented. Well, be so, God bless you. I respect you, but I know that I too am a man. By the very fact that I respect you without envy, I prove my dignity as a man. In truth, if they don't say this, for they don't know how to say this yet, that is how they act. I've seen it myself, I've known it myself, and would you believe it, the poorer our Russian peasant is, the more noticeable is that serene goodness. For the rich among them are for the most part corrupted already, and much of that is due to our carelessness and indifference. But God will save his people, for Russia is great in her humility. I dream of seeing, and seem to see clearly already, our future. It will come to pass that even the most corrupt of our rich will end by being ashamed of his riches before the poor, and the poor, seeing his humility, will understand and give way before him, will respond joyfully and kindly to his honourable shame. Believe me that it will end in that. Things are moving to that. Equality is to be found only in the spiritual dignity of man, and that will only be understood among us. If we were brothers, there would be fraternity, but before that they will never agree about the division of wealth. We preserve the image of Christ, and it will shine forth like a precious diamond to the whole world. So may it be. So may it be. Fathers and teachers. A touching incident befell me once. In my wanderings I met in the town of K my old orderly, Afanasy. It was 8 years since I'd parted from him. He chanced to see me in the marketplace, recognized me, ran up to me, and how delighted he was. He simply pounced on me. "Master, dear, is it you? It's really you I see." He took me home with him. He was no longer in the army, he was married, and already had 2 little children. He and his wife earned their living as costermongers in the marketplace. His room was poor, but bright and clean. He made me sit down, set the samovar, sent for his wife, as though my appearance were a festival for them. He brought me his children. "Bless them, father." "Is it for me to bless them? I'm only a humble monk." "I will pray for them, and for you, Afanasy Pavlovitch. I have prayed every day since that day, for it all came from you," said I. And I explained that to him as well as I could. And what do you think? The man kept gazing at me, and could not believe that I, his former master, an officer, was now before him in such a guise and position. It made him shed tears. "Why are you weeping?" said I. "Better rejoice over me, dear friend, whom I can never forget, for my path is a glad and joyful one." He did not say much, but kept sighing and shaking his head over me tenderly. "What has become of your fortune?" he asked. "I gave it to the monastery," I answered. "We live in common." After tea I began saying good-bye, and suddenly brought out half a rouble, as an offering to the monastery, and another half-rouble I saw him thrusting hurriedly into my hand. "That's for you in your wanderings. It may be of use to you, father." I took his half-rouble, bowed to him and his wife, and went out rejoicing. And on my way I thought, here we are, both now, he at home and I on the road, sighing and shaking our heads, no doubt, and yet smiling joyfully in the gladness of our hearts, remembering how God brought about our meeting. I've never seen him again since then. I had been his master and he my servant, but now when we exchanged a loving kiss with softened hearts, there was a great human bond between us. I've thought a great deal about that, and now what I think is this. Is it so inconceivable that that grand and simple-hearted unity might in due time become universal among the Russian people? I believe that it will come to pass, and that the time is at hand. And of the servants I will add this. In old days, when I was young, I was often angry with servants. The cook had served something too hot. The orderly had not brushed my clothes. But what taught me better then was a thought of my dear brother's, which I'd heard from him in childhood. Am I worth it that another should serve me and be ordered about by me in his poverty and ignorance? And I wondered at the time that such simple and self-evident ideas should be so slow to occur to our minds. It is impossible that there should be no servants in the world, but act so that your servant may be freer in spirit than if he were not a servant. And why cannot I be a servant to my servant, and even let him see it, and that without any pride on my part or any mistrust on his? Why should not my servant be like my own kindred, so that I may take him into my family and rejoice in doing so? Even now this can be done, but it will lead to the grand unity of men in the future, when a man will not seek servants for himself, or desire to turn his fellow creatures into servants as he does now, but on the contrary will long with his whole heart to be the servant of all, as the Gospel teaches. And can it be a dream that in the end man will find his joy only in deeds of light and mercy, and not in cruel pleasures as now, in gluttony, fornication, ostentation, boasting, and envious rivalry of one with the other? I firmly believe that it is not, and that the time is at hand. People laugh and ask, when will that time come, and does it look like coming? I believe that with Christ's help we shall accomplish this great thing. And how many ideas there have been on earth in the history of man which were unthinkable 10 years before they appeared. Yet, when their destined hour had come, they came forth and spread over the whole earth. So it will be with us, and our people will shine forth in the world, and all men will say, the stone which the builders rejected has become the cornerstone of the building. And we may ask the scornful themselves, if our hope is a dream, when will you build up your edifice and order things justly by your intellect alone, without Christ? If they declare that it is they who are advancing towards unity, only the most simple-hearted among them believe it, so that one may positively marvel at such simplicity. Of a truth they have more fantastic dreams than we. They aim at justice, but denying Christ they will end by flooding the earth with blood. For blood cries out for blood, and he that taketh up the sword shall perish by the sword. And if it were not for Christ's covenant, they would slaughter one another down to the last 2 men on earth. And those last 2 men would not be able to restrain each other in their pride, and the one would slay the other, and then himself. And that would come to pass, were it not for the promise of Christ that for the sake of the humble and meek the days shall be shortened. While I was still wearing an officer's uniform after my duel, I talked about servants in general society, and I remember everyone was amazed at me. What, they asked, are we to make our servants sit down on the sofa and offer them tea? And I answered them, why not? Sometimes, at least. Everyone laughed. Their question was frivolous, and my answer was not clear, but the thought in it was to some extent right. G. Of prayer, of love, and of contact with other worlds. Young man, be not forgetful of prayer. Every time you pray, if your prayer is sincere, there will be new feeling and new meaning in it, which will give you fresh courage, and you will understand that prayer is an education. Remember, too, every day, and whenever you can, repeat to yourself, Lord, have mercy on all who appear before thee today. For every hour and every moment, thousands of men leave life on this earth, and their souls appear before God. And how many of them depart in solitude, unknown, sad, dejected, that no one mourns for them or even knows where they have lived or not. And behold, from the other end of the earth perhaps your prayer for their rest will rise up to God, though you knew them not, nor they you. How touching it must be to a soul standing in dread before the Lord, to feel at that instant that for him too there is one to pray, that there is a fellow creature left on earth to love him too, and God will look on you both more graciously. For if you have had so much pity on him, how much more will he have pity, who is infinitely more loving and merciful than you? And he will forgive him for your sake. Brothers, have no fear of men's sin. Love a man even in his sin, for that is the semblance of divine love, and is the highest love on earth. Love all God's creation, the whole and every grain of sand in it. Love every leaf, every ray of God's light. Love the animals, love the plants, love everything. If you love everything, you will perceive the divine mystery in things. Once you perceive it, you will begin to comprehend it better every day, and you will come at last to love the whole world with an all-embracing love. Love the animals. God has given them the rudiments of thought and joy untroubled. Do not trouble it. Don't harass them. Don't deprive them of their happiness. Don't work against God's intent. Man, do not pride yourself on superiority to the animals. They are without sin, and you, with your greatness, defile the earth by your appearance on it, and leave the traces of your foulness after you. Alas, it is true of almost every one of us. Love children, especially, for they too are sinless like the angels. They live to soften and purify our hearts, and, as it were, to guide us. Woe to him who offends a child. Father Anfim taught me to love children. The kind, silent man used often on our wanderings to spend the farthings given us on sweets and cakes for the children. He could not pass by a child without emotion. That's the nature of the man. At some thoughts one stands perplexed, especially at the sight of men's sin, and wonders whether one should use force or humble love. Always decide to use humble love. If you resolve on that once for all, you may subdue the whole world. Loving humility is marvellously strong, the strongest of all things, and there is nothing else like it. Every day and every hour, every minute, walk round yourself and watch yourself and see that your image is a seemly one. You pass by a little child, you pass by, spiteful, with ugly words, with wrathful heart. You may not have noticed the child, but he has seen you, and your image, unseemly and ignoble, may remain in his defenceless heart. You don't know it, but you may have sown an evil seed in him, and it may grow, and all because you were not careful before the child, because you did not foster in yourself a careful, actively benevolent love. Brothers, love is a teacher, but one must know how to acquire it, for it is hard to acquire, it is dearly bought, it is won slowly by long labour. For we must love, not only occasionally, for a moment, but forever. Everyone can love occasionally, even the wicked can. My brother asked the birds to forgive him. That sounds senseless, but it is right. For all is like an ocean. All is flowing and blending. A touch in one place sets up movement at the other end of the earth. It may be senseless to beg forgiveness of the birds, but birds would be happier at your side, a little happier anyway, and children and all animals, if you yourself were nobler than you are now. It's all like an ocean, I tell you. Then you would pray to the birds too, consumed by an all-embracing love, in a sort of transport, and pray that they too will forgive you your sin. Treasure this ecstasy, however senseless it may seem to men. My friends, pray to God for gladness. Be glad as children, as the birds of heaven, and let not the sin of men confound you in your doings. Fear not that it will wear away your work and hinder its being accomplished. Do not say, sin is mighty, wickedness is mighty, evil environment is mighty, and we are lonely and helpless, and evil environment is wearing us away and hindering our good work from being done. Fly from that dejection, children. There is only one means of salvation. Then take yourself and make yourself responsible for all men's sins. That is the truth, you know, friends, for as soon as you sincerely make yourself responsible for everything and for all men, you will see at once that it is really so, and that you are to blame for everyone and for all things. But throwing your own indolence and impotence on others, you will end by sharing the pride of Satan and murmuring against God. Of the pride of Satan, what I think is this. It is hard for us on earth to comprehend it, and therefore it is so easy to fall into error and to share it, even imagining that we are doing something grand and fine. Indeed, many of the strongest feelings and movements of our nature we cannot comprehend on earth. Let not that be a stumbling block, and think not that it may serve as a justification to you for anything. For the eternal judge asks of you what you can comprehend, and not what you cannot. You will know that yourself hereafter, for you will behold all things truly then, and will not dispute them. On earth, indeed, we are as it were astray, and if it were not for the precious image of Christ before us, we should be undone and altogether lost, as was the human race before the flood. Much on earth is hidden from us, but to make up for that we have been given a precious mystic sense of our living bond with the other world, with the higher, heavenly world, and the roots of our thoughts and feelings are not here, but in other worlds. That is why the philosophers say that we cannot apprehend the reality of things on earth. God took seeds from different worlds and sowed them on this earth, and his garden grew up and everything came up that could come up. But what grows lives and is alive only through the feeling of its contact with other mysterious worlds. If that feeling grows weak or is destroyed in you, the heavenly growth will die away in you. Then you will be indifferent to life and even grow to hate it. That's what I think. H. Can a man judge his fellow creatures? Faith to the end. Remember particularly that you cannot be a judge of anyone, for no one can judge a criminal until he recognizes that he is just such a criminal as the man standing before him, and that he perhaps is more than all men to blame for that crime. When he understands that, he will be able to be a judge. Though that sounds absurd, it is true. If I had been righteous myself, perhaps there would have been no criminal standing before me. If you can take upon yourself the crime of the criminal your heart is judging, take it at once, suffer for him yourself, and let him go without reproach. And even if the law itself makes you his judge, act in the same spirit so far as possible, for he will go away and condemn himself more bitterly than you have done. If, after your kiss, he goes away untouched, mocking at you, do not let that be a stumbling block to you. It shows his time has not yet come, but it will come in due course. And if it come not, no matter. If not he, then another in his place will understand and suffer, and judge and condemn himself, and the truth will be fulfilled. Believe that. Believe it without doubt, for in that lies all the hope and faith of the saints. Work without ceasing. If you remember in the night as you go to sleep, I have not done what I ought to have done. Rise up at once and do it. If the people around you are spiteful and callous and will not hear you, fall down before them and beg their forgiveness. For in truth you are to blame for their not wanting to hear you. And if you cannot speak to them in their bitterness, serve them in silence and in humility, never losing hope. If all men abandon you and even drive you away by force, then, when you are left alone, fall on the earth and kiss it, water it with your tears, and it will bring forth fruit even though no one has seen or heard you in your solitude. Believe to the end, even if all men went astray and you were left the only one faithful. Bring your offering even then and praise God in your loneliness. And if two of you are gathered together, then there is a whole world, a world of living love. Embrace each other tenderly and praise God, for if only in you two his truth has been fulfilled. If you sin yourself and grieve even unto death for your sins or for your sudden sin, then rejoice for others, rejoice for the righteous man, rejoice that if you have sinned he is righteous and has not sinned. If the evil-doing of men moves you to indignation and overwhelming distress, even to a desire for vengeance on the evildoers, shun above all things that feeling. Go at once and seek suffering for yourself, as though you were yourself guilty of that wrong. Accept that suffering and bear it, and your heart will find comfort, and you will understand that you too are guilty. For you might have been a light to the evildoers, even as the one man sinless, and you were not a light to them. If you had been a light, you would have lightened the path for others too, and the evildoer might perhaps have been saved by your light from his sin. And even though your light was shining, yet you see men were not saved by it. Hold firm and doubt not the power of the heavenly light. Believe that if they were not saved, they will be saved hereafter. And if they are not saved hereafter, then their sons will be saved, for your light will not die even when you are dead. The righteous man departs, but his light remains. Men are always saved after the death of the deliverer. Men reject their prophets and slay them, but they love their martyrs and honor those whom they have slain. You are working for the whole. You are acting for the future. Seek no reward, for great is your reward on this earth, the spiritual joy which is only vouchsafed to the righteous man. Fear not the great nor the mighty, but be wise and ever serene. Know the measure, know the times, study that. When you are left alone, pray. Love to throw yourself on the earth and kiss it. Kiss the earth and love it with an unceasing, consuming love. Love all men, love everything. Seek that rapture and ecstasy. Water the earth with the tears of your joy and love those tears. Don't be ashamed of that ecstasy, prize it, for it is a gift of God and a great one. It is not given to many, but only to the elect. I, of hell and hell-fire, a mystic reflection. Fathers and teachers, I ponder, what is hell? I maintain that it is the suffering of being unable to love. Once, in infinite existence, immeasurable in time and space, a spiritual creature was given on his coming to earth the power of saying, I am and I love. Once, only once, there was given him a moment of active, living love. And for that was earthly life given him, and with it times and seasons. And that happy creature rejected the priceless gift, prized it and loved it not, scorned it and remained callous. Such a one, having left the earth, sees Abraham's bosom and talks with Abraham as we are told in the parable of the rich man and Lazarus, and beholds heaven, and can go up to the Lord. But that is just his torment, to rise up to the Lord without ever having loved, to be brought close to those who have loved when he has despised their love. For he sees clearly and says to himself, Now I have understanding, and though I now thirst to love, there will be nothing great, no sacrifice in my love, for my earthly life is over, and Abraham will not come even with a drop of living water. That is the gift of earthly active life, to cool the fiery thirst of spiritual love which burns in me now, though I despised it on earth. There is no more life for me, and will be no more time. Even though I would gladly give my life for others, it can never be, for that life is past, which can be sacrificed for love, and now there is a gulf fixed between that life and this existence. They talk of hell-fire in the material sense. I don't go into that mystery, and I shun it. But I think if there were fire in material sense, they would be glad of it, for I imagine that in material agony their still greater spiritual agony would be forgotten for a moment. Moreover, that spiritual agony cannot be taken from them, for that suffering is not external but within them. And if it could be taken from them, I think it would be bitterer still for the unhappy creatures. For even if the righteous in paradise forgave them, beholding their torments, and called them up to heaven in their infinite love, they would only multiply their torments, for they would arouse in them still more keenly a flaming thirst for responsive, active, and grateful love, which is now impossible. In the timidity of my heart I imagine, however, that the very recognition of this impossibility would serve at last to console them, for, accepting the love of the righteous, together with the impossibility of repaying it, by this submissiveness and the effect of this humility, they will attain at last, as it were, to a certain semblance of that active love which they scorned in life, to something like its outward expression. I'm sorry, friends and brothers, that I cannot express this clearly. But woe to those who have slain themselves on earth! Woe to the suicides! I believe that there can be none more miserable than they. They tell us that it is a sin to pray for them, and outwardly the Church, as it were, renounces them. But in my secret heart I believe that we may pray even for them. Love can never be an offence to Christ. For such as those I have prayed inwardly all my life. I confess it, fathers and teachers, and even now I pray for them every day. Oh, there are some who remain proud and fierce even in hell, in spite of their certain knowledge and contemplation of the absolute truth. There are some fearful ones who have given themselves over to Satan and his proud spirit entirely. For such, hell is voluntary and ever-consuming. They are tortured by their own choice, for they have cursed themselves, cursing God and life. They live upon their vindictive pride, like a starving man in the desert sucking blood out of his own body. But they are never satisfied, and they refuse forgiveness. They curse God, who calls them. They cannot behold the living God without hatred, and they cry out that the God of life should be annihilated, that God should destroy himself and his own creation. And they will burn in the fire of their own wrath forever, and yearn for death and annihilation. But they will not attain to death. Here Alexei Fyodorovich Karamazov's manuscript ends. I repeat, it is incomplete and fragmentary. Biographical details, for instance, cover only Father Zosima's earliest youth. Of his teaching and opinions we find brought together sayings evidently uttered on very different occasions. His utterances during the last few hours have not been kept separate from the rest, but their general character can be gathered from what we have in Alexei Fyodorovich's manuscript. The elder's death came in the end quite unexpectedly, for although those who were gathered about him that last evening realized that his death was approaching, yet it was difficult to imagine that it would come so suddenly. On the contrary, his friends, as I observed already, seeing him that night apparently so cheerful and talkative, were convinced that there was at least a temporary change for the better in his condition. Even 5 minutes before his death, they said afterwards wonderingly, it was impossible to foresee it. He seemed suddenly to feel an acute pain in his chest. He turned pale, and pressed his hands to his heart. All rose from their seats and hastened to him. But, though suffering, he still looked at them with a smile, sank slowly from his chair on his knees, then bowed his face to the ground, stretched out his arms, and as though in joyful ecstasy, praying and kissing the ground, quietly and joyfully gave up his soul to God. The news of his death spread at once through the hermitage and reached the monastery. The nearest friends of the deceased and those whose duty it was from their position began to lay out the corpse according to the ancient ritual, and all the monks gathered together in the church, and before dawn the news of the death reached the town. By the morning all the town was talking of the event, and crowds were flocking from the town to the monastery. But this subject will be treated in the next book. I will only add here that before a day had passed, something happened so unexpected, so strange, upsetting and bewildering in its effect on the monks and the townspeople, that after all these years, that day of general suspense is still vividly remembered in the town. Part 3, Book 7, Alyosha. Chapter 1. The Breath of Corruption. The body of Father Zosima was prepared for burial according to the established ritual. As is well known, the bodies of dead monks and hermits are not washed. In the words of the church ritual, if any one of the monks depart in the Lord, the monk designated, that is, whose office it is, shall wipe the body with warm water, making first the sign of the cross with a sponge on the forehead of the deceased, on the breast, on the hands and feet, and on the knees, and that is enough. All this was done by Father Paisi, who then clothed the deceased in his monastic garb, and wrapped him in his cloak, which was, according to custom, somewhat slit, to allow of its being folded about him in the form of a cross. On his head he put a hood with an 8-cornered cross. The hood was left open, and the dead man's face was covered with black gauze. In his hand was put an icon of the Saviour. Towards morning he was put in a coffin which had been made ready long before. It was decided to leave the coffin all day in the cell, in the larger room in which the elder used to receive his visitors and fellow monks. As the deceased was a priest and monk of the strictest rule, the Gospel, not the Psalter, had to be read over his body by monks in holy orders. The reading was begun by Father Yosif immediately after the Requiem service. Father Paisi desired later on to read the Gospel all day and night over his dead friend, But for the present he, as well as the father superintendent of the hermitage, was very busy and occupied, for something extraordinary and unheard of, even unseemly excitement and impatient expectation began to be apparent in the monks and the visitors from the monastery hostels, and the crowds of people flocking from the town. And as time went by, this grew more and more marked. Both the superintendent and Father Païssy did their utmost to calm the general bustle and agitation. When it was fully daylight, some people began bringing their sick, in most cases children, with them from the town, as though they had been waiting expressly for this moment to do so, evidently persuaded that the dead elder's remains had a power of healing, which would be immediately made manifest in accordance with their faith. It was only then apparent how unquestionably everyone in our town had accepted Father Zosima during his lifetime as a great saint, and those who came were far from being all of the humbler classes. This intense expectation on the part of believers, displayed with such haste, such openness, even with impatience and almost insistence, impressed Father Païssy as unseemly, though he had long foreseen something of the sort. The actual manifestation of the feeling was beyond anything he had looked for. When he came across any of the monks who displayed this excitement, Father Païssy began to reprove them. "Such immediate expectation of something extraordinary," he said, "shows a levity, possible to worldly people, but unseemly in us." But little attention was paid him, and Father Païssy noticed it uneasily. Yet he himself, if the whole truth must be told, secretly at the bottom of his heart, cherished almost the same hopes, and could not but be aware of it, though he was indignant at the too impatient expectation around him, and saw in it light-mindedness and vanity. Nevertheless, it was particularly unpleasant to him to meet certain persons, whose presence aroused in him great misgivings. In the crowd in the dead man's cell he noticed, with inward aversion, for which he immediately reproached himself, the presence of Rakitin and of the monk from Obdorsk, who was still staying in the monastery. Of both of them Father Païssy felt for some reason suddenly suspicious, though indeed he might well have felt the same about others. The monk from Obdorsk was conspicuous as the most fussy in the excited crowd. He was to be seen everywhere. Everywhere he was asking questions. Everywhere he was listening. On all sides he was whispering with a peculiar, mysterious air. His expression showed the greatest impatience and even a sort of irritation. As for Rakitin, he, as appeared later, had come so early to the hermitage at the special request of Madame Hohlakoff. As soon as that good-hearted but weak-minded woman, who could not herself have been admitted to the hermitage, waked and heard of the death of Father Zosima, she was overtaken with such intense curiosity that she promptly dispatched Rakitin to the hermitage, to keep a careful lookout and report to her by letter every half-hour or so everything that takes place. She regarded Rakitin as a most religious and devout young man. He was particularly clever in getting round people and assuming whatever part he thought most to their taste, if he detected the slightest advantage to himself from doing so. It was a bright, clear day, and many of the visitors were thronging about the tombs, which were particularly numerous round the church, and scattered here and there about the hermitage. As he walked round the hermitage, Father Païssy remembered Alyosha, and that he had not seen him for some time, not since the night. And he had no sooner thought of him than he had once noticed him in the furthest corner of the hermitage garden, sitting on the tombstone of a monk who had been famous long ago for his saintliness. He sat with his back to the hermitage and his face to the wall, and seemed to be hiding behind the tombstone. Going up to him, Father Païssy saw that he was weeping quietly, but bitterly, with his face hidden in his hands, and that his whole frame was shaking with sobs. Father Païssy stood over him for a little. "Enough, dear son, enough, dear," he pronounced with feeling at last. "Why do you weep? Rejoice, and weep not. Don't you know that this is the greatest of his days? Think only where he is now at this moment." Alyosha glanced at him, uncovering his face, which was swollen with crying, like a child's, but turned away at once without uttering a word, and hid his face in his hands again. "Maybe it is well," said Father Païssy thoughtfully. "Weep if you must. Christ has sent you those tears. Your touching tears are but a relief to your spirit, and will serve to gladden your dear heart," he added to himself, walking away from Alyosha and thinking lovingly of him. He moved away quickly, however, for he felt that he, too, might weep, looking at him. Meanwhile the time was passing. The monastery services and the requiems for the dead followed in their due course. Father Païssy again took Father Iosif's place by the coffin, and began reading the Gospel. But before 3 o'clock in the afternoon that something took place, to which I alluded at the end of the last book. Something so unexpected by all of us, and so contrary to the general hope, that, I repeat, this trivial incident has been minutely remembered to this day, in our town and all the surrounding neighbourhood. I may add here, for myself personally, that I feel it almost repulsive to recall that event, which caused such frivolous agitation, and was such a stumbling block to many, though in reality it was the most natural and trivial matter. I should, of course, have omitted all mention of it in my story, if it had not exerted a very strong influence on the heart and soul of the chief, though future, hero of my story, Alyosha, forming a crisis and turning point in his spiritual development, giving a shock to his intellect, which finally strengthened it for the rest of his life and gave it a definite aim. And so, to return to our story, when before dawn they laid Father Zosima's body in the coffin and brought it into the front room, the question of opening the windows was raised among those who were around the coffin. But this suggestion, made casually by someone, was unanswered and almost unnoticed. Some of those present may perhaps have inwardly noticed it, only to reflect that the anticipation of decay and corruption from the body of such a saint was an actual absurdity, calling for compassion, if not a smile, for the lack of faith and the frivolity it implied. For they expected something quite different. And behold, soon after midday there were signs of something, at first only observed in silence by those who came in and out, and were evidently each afraid to communicate the thought in his mind. But by 3 o'clock those signs had become so clear and unmistakable that the news swiftly reached all the monks and visitors in the hermitage, promptly penetrated to the monastery, throwing all the monks into amazement, and finally, in the shortest possible time, spread to the town, exciting everyone in it, believers and unbelievers alike. The unbelievers rejoiced, and as for the believers, some of them rejoiced even more than the unbelievers, for men love the downfall and disgrace of the righteous, as the deceased elder had said in one of his exhortations. The fact is that a smell of decomposition began to come from the coffin, growing gradually more marked, and by 3 o'clock it was quite unmistakable. In all the past history of our monastery, no such scandal could be recalled, and in no other circumstances could such a scandal have been possible, as showed itself in unseemly disorder immediately after this discovery among the very monks themselves. Afterwards, even many years afterwards, some sensible monks were amazed and horrified when they recalled that day that the scandal could have reached such proportions. For in the past, monks of very holy life had died, God-fearing old men, whose saintliness was acknowledged by all. Yet from their humble coffins, too, the breath of corruption had come, naturally, as from all dead bodies, but that had caused no scandal nor even the slightest excitement. Of course there had been in former times saints in the monastery whose memory was carefully preserved, and whose relics, according to tradition, showed no signs of corruption. This fact was regarded by the monks as touching and mysterious, and the tradition of it was cherished as something blessed and miraculous, and as a promise, by God's grace, of still greater glory from their tombs in the future. One such, whose memory was particularly cherished, was an old monk, Job, who had died 70 years before at the age of 105. He had been a celebrated ascetic, rigid in fasting and silence, and his tomb was pointed out to all visitors on their arrival with peculiar respect and mysterious hints of great hopes connected with it. That was the very tomb on which Father Païssy had found Alyosha sitting in the morning. Another memory cherished in the monastery was that of the famous Father Varsonofy, who was only recently dead and had preceded Father Zosima in the eldership. He was reverenced during his lifetime as a crazy saint by all the pilgrims to the monastery. There was a tradition that both of those had laid in their coffins as though alive, that they had showed no signs of decomposition when they were buried, and that there had been a holy light in their faces, and some people even insisted that a sweet fragrance came from their bodies. Yet, in spite of these edifying memories, it would be difficult to explain the frivolity, absurdity, and malice that were manifested beside the coffin of Father Zosima. It is my private opinion that several different causes were simultaneously at work, one of which was the deeply rooted hostility to the institution of elders as a pernicious innovation, an antipathy hidden deep in the hearts of many of the monks. Even more powerful was jealousy of the dead man's saintliness, so firmly established during his lifetime that it was almost a forbidden thing to question it. For though the late elder had won over many hearts, more by love than by miracles, and had gathered round him a mass of loving adherents, none the less, in fact, rather the more on that account, he had awakened jealousy, and so had come to have bitter enemies, secret and open, not only in the monastery but in the world outside it. He did no one any harm, but why do you think him so saintly? And that question alone, gradually repeated, gave rise at last to an intense, insatiable hatred of him. That, I believe, was why many people were extremely delighted at the smell of decomposition, which came so quickly, for not a day had passed since his death. At the same time, there were some among those who had been hitherto reverently devoted to the elder, who were almost mortified and personally affronted by this incident. This was how the thing happened. As soon as signs of decomposition had begun to appear, the whole aspect of the monks betrayed their secret motives in entering the cell. They went in, stayed a little while, and hastened out to confirm the news to the crowd of other monks waiting outside. Some of the latter shook their heads mournfully, but others did not even care to conceal the delight which gleamed unmistakably in their malignant eyes. And now no one reproached them for it. No one raised his voice in protest, which was strange, for the majority of the monks had been devoted to the dead elder. But it seemed as though God had in this case let the minority get the upper hand for a time. Visitors from outside, particularly of the educated class, soon went into the cell too, with the same spying intent. Of the peasantry few went into the cell, though there were crowds of them at the gates of the hermitage. After 3 o'clock the rush of worldly visitors was greatly increased, and this was no doubt owing to the shocking news. People were attracted who would not otherwise have come on that day, and had not intended to come, and among them were some personages of high standing. But external decorum was still preserved, and Father Paisi, with a stern face, continued firmly and distinctly reading aloud the Gospel, apparently not noticing what was taking place around him, though he had, in fact, observed something unusual long before. But at last the murmurs, first subdued but gradually louder and more confident, reached even him. "It shows God's judgment is not as man's," Father Paisi heard suddenly. The first to give utterance to this sentiment was a layman, an elderly official from the town, known to be a man of great piety, but he only repeated aloud what the monks had long been whispering. They had long before formulated this damning conclusion, and the worst of it was that a sort of triumphant satisfaction at that conclusion became more and more apparent every moment. Soon they began to lay aside even external decorum, and almost seemed to feel they had a sort of right to discard it. "And for what reason can this have happened?" some of the monks said, at first with a show of regret. "He had a small frame, and his flesh was dried up on his bones. What was there to decay?" "It must be a sign from heaven," others hastened to add, and their opinion was adopted at once without protest. For it was pointed out, too, that if the decomposition had been natural, as in the case of every dead sinner, it would have been apparent later, after a lapse of at least 24 hours. But this premature corruption was in excess of nature, and so the finger of God was evident. It was meant for a sign. This conclusion seemed irresistible. Gentle Father Iosif, the librarian, a great favourite of the dead man's, tried to reply to some of the evil speakers that this is not held everywhere alike, and that the incorruptibility of the bodies of the just was not a dogma of the Orthodox Church, but only an opinion, and that even in the most orthodox regions, at Athos, for instance, they were not greatly confounded by the smell of corruption, and there the chief sign of the glorification of the saved was not bodily incorruptibility, but the colour of the bones when the bodies have lain many years in the earth and have decayed in it. And if the bones are yellow as wax, that is the great sign that the Lord has glorified the dead saint. If they are not yellow but black, it shows that God has not deemed him worthy of such glory. That is the belief in Athos, a great place, where the orthodox doctrine has been preserved from of old, unbroken, and in its greatest purity," said Father Iosif in conclusion. But the meek father's words had little effect, and even provoked a mocking retort. "That's all pedantry and innovation, no use listening to it," the monks decided. "We stick to the old doctrine. There are all sorts of innovations nowadays. Are we to follow them all?" Added others. "We have had as many holy fathers as they had. There they are among the Turks. They've forgotten everything. Their doctrine has long been impure, and they have no bells even," the most sneering added. Father Iosif walked away grieving, the more since he'd put forward his own opinion with little confidence, as though scarcely believing in it himself. He foresaw with distress that something very unseemly was beginning, and that there were positive signs of disobedience. Little by little, all the sensible monks were reduced to silence, like Father Iosif, and so it came to pass that all who loved the elder and had accepted with devout obedience the institution of the eldership were all at once terribly cast down and glanced timidly in one another's faces when they met. Those who were hostile to the institution of elders, as a novelty, held up their heads proudly. There was no smell of corruption from the late elder Varsanofi, but a sweet fragrance, they recalled malignantly. But he gained that glory not because he was an elder, but because he was a holy man. And this was followed by a shower of criticism and even blame of Father Zosima. "His teaching was false. He taught that life is a great joy and not a vale of tears," said some of the more unreasonable. "He followed the fashionable belief. He did not recognize material fire in hell," others, still more unreasonable, added. "He was not strict in fasting, allowed himself sweet things, ate cherry jam with his tea. Ladies used to send it to him. Is it for a monk of strict rule to drink tea?" could be heard among some of the envious. "He sat in pride," the most malignant declared vindictively. "He considered himself a saint, and he took it as his due when people knelt before him." "He abused the sacrament of confession," the fiercest opponents of the institution of elders added in a malicious whisper. And among these were some of the oldest monks, strictest in their devotion, genuine ascetics, who had kept silent during the life of the deceased elder, but now suddenly unsealed their lips. And this was terrible, for their words had great influence on young monks who were not yet firm in their convictions. The monk from Obdorsk heard all this attentively, heaving deep sighs and nodding his head. "Yes, clearly Father Ferapont was right in his judgment yesterday." And at that moment Father Ferapont himself made his appearance, as though on purpose to increase the confusion. I have mentioned already that he rarely left his wooden cell by the apiary. He was seldom even seen at church, and they overlooked this neglect on the ground of his craziness, and did not keep him to the rules binding on all the rest. But if the whole truth is to be told, they hardly had a choice about it, for it would have been discreditable to insist on burdening with the common regulations so great an ascetic, who prayed day and night. He even dropped asleep on his knees. If they had insisted, the monks would have said, "He is holier than all of us, and he follows a rule harder than ours, and if he does not go to church, it's because he knows when he ought to. He has his own rule." It was to avoid the chance of these sinful murmurs Father Ferapont was left in peace. As everyone was aware, Father Ferapont particularly disliked Father Zosima, and now the news had reached him in his hut that God's judgment is not the same as man's, and that something had happened which was in excess of nature. It may well be supposed that among the first to run to him with the news was the monk from Obdorsk, who had visited him the evening before, and left his cell terror-stricken. I have mentioned above that though Father Païssy, standing firm and immovable reading the Gospel over the coffin, could not hear nor see what was passing outside the cell, he gauged most of it correctly in his heart, for he knew the men surrounding him well. He was not shaken by it, but awaited what would come next without fear, watching with penetration and insight for the outcome of the general excitement. Suddenly, an extraordinary uproar in the passage, in open defiance of decorum, burst on his ears. The door was flung open, and Father Ferapont appeared in the doorway. Behind him there could be seen accompanying him a crowd of monks, together with many people from the town. They did not, however, enter the cell, but stood at the bottom of the steps, waiting to see what Father Ferapont would say or do. For they felt, with a certain awe, in spite of their audacity, that he had not come for nothing. Standing in the doorway, Father Ferapont raised his arms, and under his right arm the keen, inquisitive little eyes of the monk from Obdorsk peeped in. He alone, in his intense curiosity, could not resist running up the steps after Father Ferapont. The others, on the contrary, pressed further back in sudden alarm when the door was noisily flung open. Holding his hands aloft, Father Ferapont suddenly roared, "Casting out, I cast out!" And turning in all directions, he began at once making the sign of the cross at each of the 4 walls and 4 corners of the cell in succession. All who accompanied Father Ferapont immediately understood his action, for they knew he always did this wherever he went, and that he would not sit down or say a word till he'd driven out the evil spirits. "Satan, go hence! Satan, go hence!" he repeated at each sign of the cross. "Casting out, I cast out!" he roared again. He was wearing his coarse gown, girt with a rope. His bare chest, covered with grey hair, could be seen under his hempen shirt. His feet were bare. As soon as he began waving his arms, the cruel irons he wore under his gown could be heard clanking. Father Païssy paused in his reading, stepped forward, and stood before him waiting. "What have you come for, worthy father? Why do you offend against good order? Why do you disturb the peace of the flock?" he said at last, looking sternly at him. "What have I come for? You ask why? What is your faith?" shouted Father Ferapont crazily. "I've come here to drive out your visitors, the unclean devils. I've come to see how many have gathered here while I've been away. I want to sweep them out with a birch broom." "You cast out the evil spirit, but perhaps you're serving him yourself?" Father Païssy went on fearlessly. "And who can say of himself, 'I am holy'? Can you, Father?" "I am unclean, not holy. I would not sit in an armchair, and would not have them bow down to me as an idol," thundered Father Ferapont. "Nowadays folk destroy the true faith. The dead man, your saint," he turned to the crowd, pointing with his finger to the coffin, "did not believe in devils. He gave medicine to keep off the devils, and so they have become as common as spiders in the corners. And now he has begun to stink himself. In that we see a great sign from God." The incident he referred to is this. One of the monks was haunted in his dreams, and later on, in waking moments, by visions of evil spirits. When, in the utmost terror, he confided this to Father Zosima, the elder had advised continual prayer and rigid fasting. But when that was of no use, he advised him, while persisting in prayer and fasting, to take a special medicine. Many persons were shocked at the time, and wagged their heads as they talked over it. And most of all Father Ferapont, to whom some of the censorious had hastened to report this extraordinary counsel on the part of the elder. "Go away, Father," said Father Païssy in a commanding voice. "It's not for man to judge, but for God. Perhaps we see here a sign, which neither you nor I nor any one of us is able to comprehend. Go, Father, and do not trouble the flock," he repeated impressively. "He did not keep the fasts according to the rule, and therefore the sign has come. That is clear, and it's a sin to hide it." The fanatic, carried away by a zeal that outstripped his reason, would not be quieted. He was seduced by sweetmeats. Ladies brought them to him in their pockets. He sipped tea, he worshipped his belly, filling it with sweet things, and his mind with haughty thought. And for this he is put to shame. You speak lightly, father. Father Paisi, too, raised his voice. I admire your fasting and severities, but you speak lightly, like some frivolous youth, fickle and childish. Go away, father, I command you. Father Paisi thundered in conclusion. I will go, said Ferapont, seeming somewhat taken aback, but still as bitter. You learned men, you are so clever, you look down upon my humbleness. I came hither with little learning, and here I have forgotten what I did know. God himself has preserved me in my weakness from your subtlety. Father Paisi stood over him, waiting resolutely. Father Ferapont paused, and suddenly leaning his cheek on his hand despondently, pronounced in a sing-song voice, looking at the coffin of the dead elder, Tomorrow they will sing over him, our helper and defender, a splendid anthem, and over me when I die all they'll sing will be, What earthly joy, a little canticle. He added with tearful regret, You are proud and puffed up, this is a vain place. He shouted suddenly like a madman, and with a wave of his hand he turned quickly and quickly descended the steps. The crowd awaiting him below wavered. Some followed him at once, and some lingered, for the cell was still open, and Father Paisi, following Father Ferapont onto the steps, stood watching him. But the excited old fanatic was not completely silenced. Walking 20 steps away, he suddenly turned towards the setting sun, raised both his arms, and as though someone had cut him down, fell to the ground with a loud scream. My God has conquered! Christ has conquered the setting sun! He shouted frantically, stretching up his hands to the sun, and falling face downwards on the ground, he sobbed like a little child, shaken by his tears and spreading out his arms on the ground. Then all rushed up to him. There were exclamations and sympathetic sobs. A kind of frenzy seemed to take possession of them all. This is the one who is a saint, this is the one who is a holy man, some cried aloud, losing their fear. This is he who should be an elder. Others added malignantly. He wouldn't be an elder, he would refuse, he wouldn't serve accursed innovation, he wouldn't imitate their foolery. Other voices chimed in at once. And it is hard to say how far they might have gone, but at that moment the bell rang, summoning them to service. All began crossing themselves at once. Father Ferapont, too, got up, and crossing himself went back to his cell without looking round, still uttering exclamations which were utterly incoherent. A few followed him, but the greater number dispersed, hastening to service. Father Paisi let Father Iosif read in his place and went down. The frantic outcries of bigots could not shake him, but his heart was suddenly filled with melancholy for some special reason, and he felt that. He stood still and suddenly wondered, Why am I sad even to dejection? And immediately grasped with surprise that his sudden sadness was due to a very small and special cause. In the crowd thronging at the entrance to the cell, he had noticed Alyosha, and he remembered that he had felt at once a pang at heart on seeing him. "Can that boy mean so much to my heart now?" he asked himself, wondering. At that moment Alyosha passed him, hurrying away, but not in the direction of the church. Their eyes met. Alyosha quickly turned away his eyes and dropped them to the ground. And from the boy's look alone, Father Paisi guessed what a great change was taking place in him at that moment. "Have you, too, fallen into temptation?" cried Father Paisi. "Can you be with those of little faith?" he added mournfully. Alyosha stood still and gazed vaguely at Father Paisi, but quickly turned his eyes away again and again looked on the ground. He stood sideways and did not turn his face to Father Paisi, who watched his attentively. "Where are you hastening? The bell calls to service," he asked again. But again Alyosha gave no answer. "Are you leaving the hermitage? What, without asking leave, without asking a blessing?" Alyosha suddenly gave a wry smile, cast a strange, very strange look at the father to whom his former guide, the former sovereign of his heart and mind, his beloved elder had confided him as he lay dying, and suddenly, still without speaking, waved his hand as though not caring even to be respectful, and with rapid steps walked towards the gates away from the hermitage. "You will come back again," murmured Father Païssy, looking after him with sorrowful surprise. Chapter 2. A Critical Moment. Father Païssy, of course, was not wrong when he decided that his dear boy would come back again. Perhaps, indeed, to some extent he penetrated with insight into the true meaning of Alyosha's spiritual condition. Yet I must frankly own that it would be very difficult for me to give a clear account of that strange, vague moment in the life of the young hero I love so much. To Father Païssy's sorrowful question, "Are you too with those of little faith?" I could, of course, confidently answer for Alyosha, "No, he is not with those of little faith. Quite the contrary. Indeed, all his trouble came from the fact that he was of great faith. But still, the trouble was there, and was so agonizing that even long afterwards Alyosha thought of that sorrowful day as one of the bitterest and most fateful days of his life. If the question is asked, could all his grief and disturbance have been only due to the fact that his elder's body had shown signs of premature decomposition, instead of at once performing miracles, I must answer without beating about the bush, yes, it certainly was. I would only beg the reader not to be in too great a hurry to laugh at my young hero's pure heart. I am far from intending to apologize for him, or to justify his innocent faith on the ground of his youth, or the little progress he had made in his studies, or any such reason. I must declare, on the contrary, that I have genuine respect for the qualities of his heart. No doubt a youth who received impressions cautiously, whose love was lukewarm, and whose mind was too prudent for his age and so of little value. Such a young man might, I admit, have avoided what happened to my hero. But in some cases it is really more creditable to be carried away by an emotion, however unreasonable, which springs from a great love, than to be unmoved, and this is even truer in youth, for a young man who is always sensible is to be suspected, and is of little worth. That's my opinion. But, reasonable people will exclaim perhaps, every young man cannot believe in such a superstition, and your hero is no model for others. To this I reply again, yes, my hero had faith, a faith holy and steadfast, but still I'm not going to apologize for him. Though I declared above, and perhaps too hastily, that I should not explain or justify my hero, I see that some explanation is necessary for the understanding of the rest of my story. Let me say, then, it was not a question of miracles. There was no frivolous and impatient expectation of miracles in his mind. And Alyosha needed no miracles at the time for the triumph of some preconceived idea. Oh, no, not at all. What he saw before all was one figure, the figure of his beloved elder, the figure of that holy man whom he revered with such adoration. The fact is that all the love that lay concealed in his pure young heart for everyone and everything had, for the past year, been concentrated, and perhaps wrongly so, on one being, his beloved elder. It is true that being had for so long been accepted by him as his ideal, that all his young strength and energy could not but turn towards that ideal, even to the forgetting at the moment of everyone and everything. He remembered afterwards how on that terrible day he had entirely forgotten his brother Dmitri, about whom he had been so anxious and troubled the day before. He had forgotten, too, to take the 200 roubles to Ilusha's father, though he had so warmly intended to do so the preceding evening. But again, it was not miracles he needed, but only the higher justice, which had been in his belief outraged by the blow that had so suddenly and cruelly wounded his heart. And what does it signify that this justice, looked for by Alyosha, inevitably took the shape of miracles to be wrought immediately by the ashes of his adored teacher? Why, everyone in the monastery cherished the same thought and the same hope, even those whose intellects Alyosha revered, Father Païssy himself, for instance. And so Alyosha, untroubled by doubts, clothed his dreams too in the same form as all the rest. And a whole year of life in the monastery had formed the habit of this expectation in his heart. But it was justice he thirsted for, not simply miracles. And now the man who should, he believed, have been exalted above everyone in the whole world, that man, instead of receiving the glory that was his due, was suddenly degraded and dishonoured. What for? Who had judged him? Who could have decreed this? Those were the questions that wrung his inexperienced and virginal heart. He could not endure without mortification, without resentment even, that the holiest of holy men should have been exposed to the jeering and spiteful mockery of the frivolous crowd so inferior to him. Even had there been no miracles, had there been nothing marvellous to justify his hopes, why this indignity, why this humiliation, why this premature decay in excess of nature? As the spiteful monks said, why this sign from heaven, which they so triumphantly acclaimed in company with Father Therapont? And why did they believe they had gained the right to acclaim it? Where is the finger of Providence? Why did Providence hide its face at the most critical moment? So Alyosha thought it, as though voluntarily submitting to the blind, dumb, pitiless laws of nature. That was why Alyosha's heart was bleeding, and of course, as I have said already, the sting of it all was that the man he loved above everything on earth should be put to shame and humiliated. This murmuring may have been shallow and unreasonable in my hero, but I repeat again for the third time, and am prepared to admit that it might be difficult to defend my feeling. I am glad that my hero showed himself not too reasonable at that moment, for any man of sense will always come back to reason in time. But if love does not gain the upper hand in a boy's heart at such an exceptional moment, when will it? I will not, however, omit to mention something strange, which came for a time to the surface of Alyosha's mind at this fatal and obscure moment. This new something was the harassing impression left by the conversation with Ivan, which now persistently haunted Alyosha's mind. At this moment it haunted him. Oh, it was not that something of the fundamental, elemental, so to speak, faith of his soul had been shaken. He loved his God and believed in him steadfastly, though he was suddenly murmuring against him. Yet a vague but tormenting and evil impression left by his conversation with Ivan the day before suddenly revived again now in his soul and seemed forcing its way to the surface of his consciousness. It had begun to get dark when Rakitin, crossing the pine copse from the hermitage to the monastery, suddenly noticed Alyosha lying face downwards on the ground under a tree, not moving and apparently asleep. He went up and called him by his name. "You here, Alexei? Can you have—" He began wondering, but broke off. He had meant to say, "Can you have come to this?" Alyosha did not look at him, but from a slight movement Rakitin at once saw that he heard and understood him. "What's the matter?" he went on, but the surprise in his face gradually passed into a smile that became more and more ironical. "I say, I've been looking for you for the last 2 hours. You suddenly disappeared. What you about? What foolery is this? You might just look at me." Alyosha raised his head, sat up and leaned his back against the tree. He was not crying, but there was a look of suffering and irritability in his face. He did not look at Rakitin, however, but looked away to one side of him. "Do you know, your face is quite changed. There's none of your famous mildness to be seen in it. Are you angry with someone? Have they been ill-treating you?" "Let me alone," said Alyosha suddenly, with a weary gesture of his hand, still looking away from him. "Oh-ho, so that's how we are feeling. So you can shout at people like other mortals. This is a come-down from the angels. I say, Alyosha, you've surprised me, do you hear? I mean it. It's long since I've been surprised at anything here. I always took you for an educated man." Alyosha at last looked at him, but vaguely, as though scarcely understanding what he said. "Can you really be so upset, simply because your old man has begun to stink? You don't mean to say you seriously believed that he was going to work miracles?" exclaimed Rakitin, genuinely surprised again. I believe, I want to believe, and I will believe. What more do you want?" cried Alyosha irritably. "Nothing at all, my boy, damn it all. Why, no schoolboy of 13 believes in that now. But there. So, now you're in a temper with your God, you're rebelling against him. He hasn't given promotion, he hasn't bestowed the Order of Merit. Hey, you are a set." Alyosha gazed a long while with his eyes half closed at Rakitin, and there was a sudden gleam in his eyes, but not of anger with Rakitin. "I'm not rebelling against my God. I simply don't accept his world." Alyosha suddenly smiled a forced smile. "How do you mean you don't accept the world?" Rakitin thought a moment over his answer. "What idiocy is this?" Alyosha did not answer. "Come, enough nonsense. Now to business. Have you had anything to eat today?" "I don't remember. I think I have." "You need keeping up, to judge by your face. It makes one sorry to look at you. You didn't sleep all night either, I hear. You had a meeting in there, and then all this bobbery afterwards. Most likely you've had nothing to eat but a mouthful of holy bread. I've got some sausage in my pocket. I've brought it from the town in case of need. Only you won't eat sausage." "Give me some." "I say, you are going it. Why, it's a regular mutiny with barricades. Well, my boy, we must make the most of it. Come to my place. I shouldn't mind a drop of vodka myself. I'm tired to death. Vodka's going too far for you, I suppose. Or would you like some?"
"Give me some vodka, too."
"Hello, you surprise me, brother."
Rakitin looked at him in amazement.
"Well, one way or another, vodka or sausage, this is a jolly fine chance and mustn't be missed. Come along."
Alyosha got up in silence and followed Rakitin.
"If your little brother Ivan could see this, wouldn't he be surprised? By the way, your brother Ivan set off to Moscow this morning, did you know?"
"Yes," answered Alyosha listlessly, and suddenly the image of his brother Dmitri rose before his mind. But only for a minute, and though it reminded him of something that must not be put off for a moment, some duty, some terrible obligation, even that reminder made no impression on him, did not reach his heart, and instantly faded out of his mind and was forgotten. But a long while afterwards Alyosha remembered this. "Your brother Ivan declared once that I was a liberal booby with no talents whatever. Once you, too, could not resist letting me know I was dishonourable. Well, I should like to see what your talents and sense of honour will do for you now." This phrase Rakitin finished to himself in a whisper.
"Listen," he said aloud, "let's go by the path beyond the monastery straight to the town. I ought to go to Madame Holocaust's, by the way. Only fancy, I've written to tell her everything that happened, and would you believe it, she answered me instantly in pencil. The lady has a passion for writing notes, that she would never have expected such conduct from a man of such a reverend character as Father Zosima. That was her very word, conduct. She's angry, too. Hey, you are a set. Stay!" he cried suddenly again. He suddenly stopped, and taking Alyosha by the shoulder, made him stop too. "Do you know, Alyosha?" He peeped inquisitively in his eyes, absorbed in a sudden new thought which had dawned on him, and though he was laughing outwardly, he was evidently afraid to utter that new idea aloud. So difficult he still found it to believe in the strange and unexpected mood in which he now saw Alyosha. "Alyosha, do you know where we'd better go?" he brought out at last timidly and insinuatingly.
"I don't care. Where you like."
"Let's go to Grushenka, eh? Will you come?" pronounced Rakitin at last, trembling with timid suspense.
"Let's go to Grushenka," Alyosha answered calmly, "at once." And this prompt and calm agreement was such a surprise to Rakitin that he almost started back.
"Well, I say!"
he cried in amazement. But seizing Alyosha firmly by the arm, he led him along the path, still dreading that he would change his mind. They walked along in silence. Rakitin was positively afraid to talk.
"And how glad she will be, how delighted,"
he muttered, but lapsed into silence again.
And indeed it was not to please Grushenka he was taking Alyosha to her. He was a practical person and never undertook anything without a prospect of gain for himself. His object in this case was twofold. First, a revengeful desire to see the downfall of the righteous, and Alyosha's fall from the saints to the sinners, over which he was already gloating in his imagination. And in the second place he had in view a certain material gain for himself, of which more will be said later. "So, the critical moment has come," he thought to himself with spiteful glee, "and we shall catch it on the hop, for it's just what we want." Chapter 3. An Onion. Grushenka lived in the busiest part of the town, near the cathedral square, in a small wooden lodge in the courtyard belonging to the house of the widow Morozov. The house was a large stone building of 2 stories, old and very ugly. The widow led a secluded life with her 2 unmarried nieces, who were also elderly women. She had no need to let her lodge, but everyone knew that she'd taken in Grushenka as a lodger 4 years before, solely to please her kinsman, the merchant Samsonov, who was known to be the girl's protector. It was said that the jealous old man's object in placing his favourite with the widow Morozov
was that the old woman should keep a sharp eye on her new lodger's conduct. But this sharp eye soon proved to be unnecessary, and in the end the widow Morozov seldom met Grushenka, and did not worry her by looking after her in any way. It is true that 4 years had passed since the old man had brought the slim, delicate, shy, timid, dreamy, and sad girl of 18 from the chief town of the province, and much had happened since then. Little was known of the girl's history in the town, and that little was vague. Nothing more had been learnt during the last 4 years, even after many persons had become interested in the beautiful young woman into whom Agrafena Alexandrovna had meanwhile developed. There were rumours that she had been at 17 betrayed by someone, some sort of officer, and immediately afterwards abandoned by him. The officer had gone away and afterwards married, while Grushenka had been left in poverty and disgrace. It was said, however, that though Grushenka had been raised from destitution by the old man, Samsonov, she came of a respectable family belonging to the clerical class, that she was the daughter of a deacon or something of the sort. And now, after 4 years, the sensitive, injured, and pathetic little orphan had become a plump, rosy beauty of the Russian type, a woman of bold and determined character, proud and insolent. She had a good head for business, was acquisitive, saving, and careful, and by fair means or foul had succeeded, it was said, in amassing a little fortune. There was only one point on which all were agreed. Grushenka was not easily to be approached, and except her aged protector there had not been one man who could boast of her favours during those 4 years. It was a positive fact, for there had been a good many, especially during the last 2 years, who had attempted to obtain those favours. But all their efforts had been in vain, and some of these suitors had been forced to beat an undignified and even comic retreat, owing to the firm and ironical resistance they met from the strong-willed young person. It was known, too, that the young person had, especially of late, been given to what is called speculation, and that she had shown marked abilities in that direction, so that many people began to say that she was no better than a Jew. It was not that she lent money on interest, but it was known, for instance, that she had for some time past, in partnership with old Karamazov, actually invested in the purchase of bad debts for a trifle, a tenth of their nominal value, and afterwards had made out of them 10 times their value. The old widower Samsonov, a man of large fortune, was stingy and merciless. He tyrannized over his grown-up sons, but for the last year, during which he had been ill and lost the use of his swollen legs, he had fallen greatly under the influence of his protégé, whom he had at first kept strictly and in humble surroundings, on Lenten fare, as the wits said at the time. But Grushenka had succeeded in emancipating herself, while she established in him a boundless belief in her fidelity. The old man, now long since dead, had had a large business in his day, and was also a noteworthy character, miserly and hard as flint. Though Grushenka's hold upon him was so strong that he could not live without her, it had been so especially for the last 2 years, he did not settle any considerable fortune on her, and would not have been moved to do so if she had threatened to leave him. But he had presented her with a small sum, and even that was a surprise to everyone when it became known. "You are a wench with brains," he said to her when he gave her 8,000 roubles, "and you must look after yourself. But let me tell you that accept your yearly allowance as before you'll get nothing more from me to the day of my death, and I'll leave you nothing in my will either." And he kept his word. He died and left everything to his sons, whom, with their wives and children, he had treated all his life as servants. Grushenka was not even mentioned in his will. All this became known afterwards. He helped Grushenka with his advice to increase her capital and put business in her way. When Fyodor Pavlovitch, who first came into contact with Grushenka over a piece of speculation, ended to his own surprise by falling madly in love with her, old Samsonov, gravely ill as he was immensely amused. It is remarkable that throughout their whole acquaintance Grushenka was absolutely and spontaneously open with the old man, and he seems to have been the only person in the world with whom she was so. Of late, when Dmitri too had come on the scene with his love, the old man left off laughing. On the contrary, he once gave Grushenka a stern and earnest piece of advice.
If you have to choose between the two, father or son, you better choose the old man, if only you make sure the old scoundrel will marry you and settle some fortune on you beforehand. But don't keep on with the captain, you'll get no good out of that.'
These were the very words of the old profligate, who felt already that his death was not far off, and who actually died 5 months later. I will note, too, in passing, that although many in our town knew of the grotesque and monstrous rivalry of the Karamazovs, father and son, the object of which was Grushenka, scarcely anyone understood what really underlay her attitude to both of them. Even Grushenka's 2 servants, after the catastrophe of which we will speak later, testified in court that she received Dmitri Fyodorovitch simply from fear because he threatened to murder her. These servants were an old cook, invalidish and almost deaf, who came from Grushenka's old home, and her granddaughter, a smart young girl of 20, who performed the duties of a maid. Grushenka lived very economically, and her surroundings were anything but luxurious. Her lodge consisted of 3 rooms, furnished with mahogany furniture in the fashion of 1820, belonging to her landlady. It was quite dark when Rakitin and Alyosha entered her rooms, yet they were not lighted up. Grushenka was lying down in her drawing-room on the big, hard, clumsy sofa, with a mahogany back. The sofa was covered with shabby and ragged leather. Under her head she had 2 white down pillows taken from her bed. She was lying, stretched out motionless on her back, with her hands behind her head. She was dressed as though expecting someone, in a black silk dress, with a dainty lace fichu on her head, which was very becoming. Over her shoulders was thrown a lace shawl pinned with a massive gold brooch. She certainly was expecting someone. She lay as though impatient and weary, her face rather pale, and her lips and eyes hot, restlessly tapping the arm of the sofa with the tip of her right foot. The appearance of Rakitin and Alyosha caused a slight excitement. From the hall they could hear Grushenka leap up from the sofa and cry out in a frightened voice, "Who's there?" But the maid met the visitors and at once called back to her mistress, "It's not he, it's nothing, only other visitors."
"What can be the matter?" muttered Rakitin, leading Alyosha into the drawing-room.
Grushenka was standing by the sofa as though still alarmed. A thick coil of her dark brown hair escaped from its lace covering and fell on her right shoulder. But she did not notice it, and did not put it back till she gazed at her visitors and recognized them.
"Ah, it's you, Rakitin. You quite frightened me. Whom have you brought? Who is this with you? Good heavens, you've brought him!"
she exclaimed, recognizing Alyosha.
"Do send for candles,"
said Rakitin, with the free and easy air of a most intimate friend, who is privileged to give orders in the house.
"Candles, of course, candles. Fenya, fetch him a candle. Well, you have chosen a moment to bring him,"
she exclaimed again. Nodding towards Alyosha and turning to the looking-glass, she began quickly fastening up her hair with both hands. She seemed displeased.
"Haven't I managed to please you?"
asked Rakitin, instantly almost offended.
"You frighten me, Rakitin, that's what it is."
Grushenka turned with a smile to Alyosha.
"Don't be afraid of me, my dear Alyosha. You can't think how glad I am to see you, my unexpected visitor. But you frighten me, Rakitin. I thought it was Mitya breaking in. You see, I deceived him just now. I made him promise to believe me, and I told him a lie. I told him that I was going to spend the evening with my old man, Kuzma Kuzmich, and should be there till late, counting up his money. I always spend 1 whole evening a week with him making up his accounts. We lock ourselves in and he counts on the reckoning beads while I sit and put things down in the book. I'm the only person he trusts. Mitya believes that I'm there, but I came back and have been sitting locked in here, expecting some news. How was it Fenya let you in? Fenya, run out to the gate, open it, and look about whether the captain is to be seen. Perhaps he's hiding and spying. I'm dreadfully frightened. There's no one there, Agrafena Alexandrovna. I've just looked out. I keep running to peep through the crack. I'm in fear and trembling myself. Are the shutters fastened, Fenya? And we must draw the curtains. That's better."
She drew the heavy curtains herself.
"He'd rush in at once if he saw a light. I'm afraid of your brother Mitya today, Alyosha.
Grushenka spoke aloud, and though she was alarmed, she seemed very happy about something. "Why are you so afraid of Mitya today?" inquired Rakitin. "I should have thought you were not timid with him. You'd twist him round your little finger."
"I tell you I'm expecting news, priceless news, so I don't want Mitya at all. And he didn't believe, I feel he didn't, that I should stay at Kuzma Kuzmich's. He must be in his ambush now behind Fyodor Pavlovitch's in the garden, watching for me. And if he's there, he won't come here, so much the better. But I really have been to Kuzma Kuzmich's. Mitya escorted me there. I told him I should stay there till midnight, and I asked him to be sure to come at midnight to fetch me home. He went away, and I sat 10 minutes with Kuzma Kuzmich and came back here again. Oh, I was afraid. I ran for fear of meeting him."
"And why are you so dressed up? What a curious cap you've got on."
"How curious you are yourself, Rakitin. I tell you, I'm expecting a message. If the message comes, I shall fly. I shall gallop away, and you will see no more of me. That's why I'm dressed up, so as to be ready."
"And where are you flying to?"
"If you know too much, you'll get old too soon."
"Upon my word, you are highly delighted. I've never seen you like this before. You're dressed up as if you were going to a ball."
Rakitin looked her up and down. "Much you know about balls."
"And do you know much about them?"
"I have seen a ball the year before last, Kuzma Kuzmich's son was married, and I looked on from the gallery. Do you suppose I want to be talking to you, Rakitin, while a prince like this is standing here? Such a visitor! Alyosha, my dear boy, I gaze at you and can't believe my eyes. Good heavens! Can you have come here to see me? To tell you the truth, I never had a thought of seeing you, and I didn't think that you would ever come and see me. Though this is not the moment now, I'm awfully glad to see you. Sit down on the sofa here, that's right, my bright young moon. I really can't take it in even now. Hey, Rakitin, if only you'd brought him yesterday or the day before. But I am glad as it is. Perhaps it's better he has come now at such a moment, and not the day before yesterday."
She gaily sat down beside Alyosha on the sofa, looking at him with positive delight. And she really was glad. She was not lying when she said so. Her eyes glowed, her lips laughed, but it was a good-natured, merry laugh. Alyosha had not expected to see such a kind expression in her face. He had hardly met her till the day before. He'd formed an alarming idea of her, and had been horribly distressed the day before by the spiteful and treacherous trick she'd played on Katerina Ivanovna. He was greatly surprised to find her now altogether different from what he'd expected, and, crushed as he was by his own sorrow, his eyes involuntarily rested on her with attention. Her whole manner seemed changed for the better since yesterday. There was scarcely any trace of that mawkish sweetness in her speech, of that voluptuous softness in her movements. Everything was simple and good-natured. Her gestures were rapid, direct, confiding. But she was greatly excited.
"Dear me, how everything comes together today," she chattered on again. "And why I'm so glad to see you, Alyosha, I couldn't say myself. If you ask me, I couldn't tell you."
"Come, don't you know why you're glad?" said Rakitin, grinning. "You used to be always pestering me to bring him. You'd some object, I suppose."
"I had a different object once, but now that's over. This is not the moment. I say, I want you to have something nice. I'm so good-natured now. You sit down too, Rakitin. Why are you standing? You've sat down already. There's no fear of Rakitin's forgetting to look after himself. Look, Alyosha, he's sitting there opposite us, so offended that I didn't ask him to sit down before you. Oh, Rakitin is such a one to take offence," laughed Grushenka. "Don't be angry, Rakitin. I'm kind today. Why are you so depressed, Alyosha? Are you afraid of me?"
She peeped into his eyes with merry mockery. "He's sad. The promotion has not been given," boomed Rakitin.
"What promotion?"
"His elder stinks."
"What? You're talking some nonsense. You want to say something nasty. Be quiet, you stupid. Let me sit on your knee, Alyosha, like this."
She suddenly skipped forward and jumped, laughing, on his knees, like a nestling kitten, with her right arm about his neck.
"I'll cheer you up, my pious boy. Yes, really, will you let me sit on your knee? You won't be angry if you tell me I'll get off."
Alyosha did not speak. He sat, afraid to move. He heard her words, "If you tell me, I'll get off." But he did not answer. But there was nothing in his heart such as Rakitin, for instance, watching him malignantly from his corner, might have expected or fancied. The great grief in his heart swallowed up every sensation that might have been aroused, and if only he could have thought clearly at that moment, he would have realized that he had now the strongest armour to protect him from every lust and temptation. Yet, in spite of the vague irresponsiveness of his spiritual condition, and the sorrow that overwhelmed him, he could not help wondering at a new and strange sensation in his heart. This woman, this dreadful woman, had no terror for him now, none of that terror that had stirred in his soul at any passing thought of woman. On the contrary, this woman, dreaded above all women, sitting now on his knee, holding him in her arms, aroused in him now a quite different, unexpected, peculiar feeling, a feeling of the intensest and purest interest, without a trace of fear, of his former terror. That was what instinctively surprised him. "You've talked nonsense enough," cried Rakitin. "You much better give us some champagne. You owe it me, you know you do."
"Yes, I really do. Do you know, Alyosha, I promised him champagne on the top of everything if he'd bring you. I'll have some too. Fenya, bring us the bottle Mitya left. Look sharp. Though I am so stingy, I'll stand a bottle. Not for you, Rakitin, you're a toadstool, but he is a falcon. And though my heart is full of something very different, so be it, I'll drink with you. I long for some dissipation."
"But what's the matter with you, and what is this message, may I ask, or is it a secret?" Rakitin put in inquisitively, doing his best to pretend not to notice the snubs that were being continually aimed at him.
It's not a secret, and you know it too,"
Grushenka said in a voice suddenly anxious, turning her head towards Rakitin and drawing a little away from Alyosha, though she still sat on his knee with her arm round his neck.
"My officer is coming, Rakitin. My officer is coming."
"I heard he was coming, but is he so near?"
"He's at Mokroe now. He'll send a messenger from there, so he wrote. I got a letter from him today. I'm expecting the messenger every minute."
"You don't say so. Why at Mokroe?"
"And that's a long story. I've told you enough."
"Mitya will be up to something now. I say, does he know, or doesn't he?"
No, of course he doesn't. If he knew, there'd be murder. But I'm not afraid of that now. I'm not afraid of his knife. Be quiet, Rakitin. Don't remind me of Dmitri Fyodorovitch. He has bruised my heart, and I don't want to think of that at this moment. I can think of Alyosha here. I can look at Alyosha. Smile at me, dear. Cheer up. Smile at my foolishness, at my pleasure. Ah, he's smiling. He's smiling. How kindly he looks at me. And you know, Alyosha, I've been thinking all this time you were angry with me because of the day before yesterday, because of that young lady. I was a cur, that's the truth. But it's a good thing it happened so. It was a horrid thing, but a good thing too."
Grushenka smiled dreamily, and a little cruel line showed in her smile.
"Mitya told me that she screamed out that I ought to be flogged. I did insult her dreadfully. She sent for me. She wanted to make a conquest of me, to win me over with her chocolate. No, it's a good thing it did end like that."
She smiled again.
"But I'm still afraid of your being angry."
"Yes, that's really true," Rakitin put in suddenly with genuine surprise. "Alyosha, she is really afraid of a chicken like you."
"He's a chicken to you, Rakitin, because you've no conscience, that's what it is. You see, I love him with all my soul, that's how it is. Alyosha, do you believe I love you with all my soul?"
"Ah, you shameless woman, she's making you a declaration, Alexei."
"Well, what of it? I love him."
"And what about your officer, and the priceless message from Mokroe?"
"That's quite different."
"That's a woman's way of looking at it."
"Don't you make me angry, Rakitin."
Grushenka caught him up hotly.
"This is quite different. I love Alyosha in a different way. It's true, Alyosha, I had sly designs on you before, for I am a horrid, violent creature. But at other times I've looked upon you, Alyosha, as my conscience. I've kept thinking how anyone like that must despise a nasty thing like me. I thought that the day before yesterday as I ran home from the young ladies. I've thought of you a long time in that way, Alyosha, and Mitya knows. I've talked to him about it. Mitya understands. Would you believe it, I sometimes look at you and feel ashamed, utterly ashamed of myself. And how, and since when, I began to think about you like that, I can't say. I don't remember.
Fenya came in and put a tray with an uncorked bottle and 3 glasses of champagne on the table. "Here's the champagne!" cried Rakitin. "You're excited, Agrafena Alexandrovna, and not yourself. When you've had a glass of champagne, you'll be ready to dance. Eh? They can't even do that properly," he added, looking at the bottle. "The old woman's poured it out in the kitchen, and the bottle's been brought in warm and without a cork. Well, let me have some anyway." He went up to the table, took a glass, emptied it at one gulp, and poured himself out another. "One doesn't often stumble upon champagne," he said, licking his lips. "Now, Alyosha, take a glass, show what you can do. What shall we drink to? The gates of paradise? Take a glass, Grushenka. You drink to the gates of paradise, too."
"What gates of paradise?"
She took a glass. Alyosha took his, tasted it, and put it back.
"No, I'd better not."
He smiled gently. "And you bragged!" cried Rakitin.
"Well, if so, I won't either," chimed in Grushenka. "I really don't want any. You can drink the whole bottle alone, Rakitin. If Alyosha has some, I will."
"What touching sentimentality!" said Rakitin tauntingly. "And she's sitting on his knee, too. He's got something to grieve over, but what's the matter with you? He's rebelling against his God and ready to eat sausage."
"How so?"
"His elder died today, Father Zosima, the saint."
"So, Father Zosima is dead," cried Grushenka. "Good God, I did not know." She crossed herself devoutly. "Goodness, what have I been doing, sitting on his knee like this at such a moment?"
She started up, as though in dismay. Instantly he slipped off his knee and sat down on the sofa. Alyosha bent a long, wondering look upon her, and a light seemed to dawn in his face.
"Rakitin,"
he said suddenly in a firm and loud voice, "don't taunt me with having rebelled against God. I don't want to feel angry with you, so you must be kinder too. I've lost a treasure such as you have never had, and you cannot judge me now. You'd much better look at her. Do you see how she has pity on me? I came here to find a wicked soul. I felt drawn to evil because I was base and evil myself. And I've found a true sister, I've found a treasure, a loving heart. She had pity on me just now. Agrafena Alexandrovna, I'm speaking of you. You've raised my soul from the depths." Alyosha's lips were quivering, and he caught his breath. "She has saved you, it seems," laughed Rakitin spitefully. "And she meant to get you in her clutches, do you realize that?"
"Stay, Rakitin."
Grushenka jumped up.
"Hush, both of you. Now I'll tell you all about it. Hush, Alyosha, your words make me ashamed, for I'm bad and not good. That's what I am. And you hush, Rakitin, because you're telling lies. I had the low idea of trying to get him in my clutches, but now you're lying, now it's all different. And don't let me hear anything more from you, Rakitin."
All this Grushenka said with extreme emotion. "They're both crazy," said Rakitin, looking at them with amazement. "I feel as though I'm in a madhouse. They're both getting so feeble they'll begin crying in a minute."
"I shall begin to cry. I shall," repeated Grushenka. "He called me his sister, and I shall never forget that. Only let me tell you, Rakitin, though I am bad, I did give away an onion."
"An onion? Hang it all, you really are crazy." Rakitin wondered at their enthusiasm. He was aggrieved and annoyed, though he might have reflected that each of them was just passing through a spiritual crisis, such as does not come often in a lifetime. But though Rakitin was very sensitive about everything that concerned himself, he was very obtuse as regards the feelings and sensations of others, partly from his youth and inexperience, partly from his intense egoism.
"You see, Alyosha,"
Grushenka turned to him with a nervous laugh,
"I was boasting when I told Rakitin I'd given away an onion. But it's not to boast I tell you about it. It's only a story, but it's a nice story. I used to hear it when I was a child from Matryona, my cook, who was still with me. It's like this. Once upon a time there was a peasant woman, and a very wicked woman she was, and she died, and did not leave a single good deed behind. The devils caught her and plunged her into the lake of fire. So her guardian angel stood and wondered what good deed of hers he could remember to tell to God. She once pulled up an onion in her garden, said he, and gave it to a beggar woman. And God answered, 'You take that onion then, Hold it out to her in the lake, and let her take hold and be pulled out. And if you can pull her out of the lake, let her come to paradise. But if the onion breaks, then the woman must stay where she is." The angel ran to the woman and held out the onion to her. "Come," said he, "catch hold and I'll pull you out." And he began cautiously pulling her out. He had just pulled her right out, when the other sinners in the lake, seeing how she was being drawn out, began catching hold of her so as to be pulled out with her. But she was a very wicked woman, and she began kicking them. "I'm to be pulled out, not you. It's my onion, not yours." As soon as she said that, the onion broke, and the woman fell into the lake, and she's burning there to this day. So the angel wept and went away. So that's the story, Alyosha. I know it by heart, for I am that wicked woman myself. I boasted to Rakitin that I'd given away an onion, but to you I'll say, I've done nothing but give away one onion all my life. That's the only good deed I've done. So don't praise me, Alyosha. Don't think me good. I am bad. I'm a wicked woman, and you make me ashamed if you praise me. Nay, I must confess everything. Listen, Alyosha. I was so anxious to get hold of you that I promised Rakitin 25 roubles if he would bring you to me. Stay, Rakitin, wait. She went with rapid steps to the table, opened a drawer, pulled out a purse and took from it a 25-rouble note. "What nonsense! What nonsense!" cried Rakitin, disconcerted. "Take it, Rakitin. I owe it to you. There's no fear of your refusing it. You asked for it yourself." And she threw the note to him. "Likely I should refuse it," boomed Rakitin, obviously abashed, but carrying off his confusion with a swagger. "That will come in very handy. Fools are made for wise men's profit." "And now hold your tongue, Rakitin. What am I going to say now is not for your ears. Sit down in that corner and keep quiet. You don't like us, so hold your tongue." "What should I like you for?" Rakitin snarled, not concealing his ill-humour. He put the 25-rouble note in his pocket, and he felt ashamed at Alyosha's seeing it. He had reckoned on receiving his payment later, without Alyosha's knowing of it, and now, feeling ashamed, he lost his temper. Till that moment he had thought it discreet not to contradict Grushenka too flatly, in spite of her snubbing, since he had something to get out of her. But now he, too, was angry. "One loves people for some reason. What have either of you done for me?" "You should love people without a reason, as Alyosha does." "How does he love you? How has he shown it that you make such a fuss about it?" Grushenka was standing in the middle of the room. She spoke with heat, and there were hysterical notes in her voice. "Hush, Rakitin. You know nothing about us, and don't dare to speak to me like that again. How dare you be so familiar? Sit in that corner and be quiet as though you were my footman. And now, Alyosha, I'll tell you the whole truth, that you may see what a wretch I am. I'm not talking to Rakitin, but to you. I wanted to ruin you, Alyosha, that's the holy truth. I quite meant to. I wanted to so much that I bribed Rakitin to bring you. And why did I want to do such a thing? You knew nothing about it, Alyosha. You turned away from me. If you passed me, you dropped your eyes. And I've looked at you 100 times before today. I began asking everyone about you. Your face haunted my heart. He despises me, I thought. He won't even look at me. And I felt it so much at last that I wondered at myself for being so frightened of a boy. I'll get him in my clutches and laugh at him. I was full of spite and anger. Would you believe it? Nobody here dares talk or think of coming to Agrafena Alexandrovna with any evil purpose. Old Kuzma is the only man I have anything to do with here. I was bound and sold to him. Satan brought us together. But there's been no one else. But looking at you, I thought, I'll get him in my clutches and laugh at him. You see what a spiteful cur I am, and you called me your sister. And now that man who wronged me has come. I sit here waiting for a message from him. And do you know what that man has been to me? 5 years ago, when Kuzma brought me here, I used to shut myself up, that no one might have sight or sound of me. I was a silly slip of a girl. I used to sit here sobbing. I used to lie awake all night, thinking, where is he now, the man who wronged me? He's laughing at me with another woman, most likely. If only I could see him. If I could meet him again, I'd pay him out. I'd pay him out. At night I used to lie sobbing into my pillow in the dark, and I used to brood over it. I used to tear my heart on purpose and gloss over my anger. I'll pay him out, I'll pay him out. That's what I used to cry out in the dark. And when I suddenly thought that I should really do nothing to him, and that he was laughing at me then, or perhaps had utterly forgotten me, I would fling myself on the floor, melt into helpless tears, and lie there shaking till dawn. In the morning I would get up more spiteful than a dog, ready to tear the whole world to pieces. And then, what do you think? I began saving money. I became hard-hearted, grew stout, grew wiser, would you say? No, no one in the world sees it, no one knows it. But when night comes on, I sometimes lie, as I did 5 years ago when I was a silly girl, clenching my teeth and crying all night, thinking, I'll pay him out, I'll pay him out. Do you hear? Well then, now you understand me. A month ago a letter came to me. He was coming, he was a widower, he wanted to see me. It took my breath away. Then I suddenly thought, if he comes and whistles to call me, I shall creep back to him like a beaten dog. I couldn't believe myself. Am I so abject? Shall I run to him or not? And I've been in such a rage with myself all this month that I'm worse than I was 5 years ago. Do you see now, Alyosha, what a vile and vindictive creature I am? I've shown you the whole truth. I played with Mitya to keep me from running to that other. Hush, Rakitin, it's not for you to judge me. I'm not speaking to you. Before you came in, I was lying here waiting, brooding, deciding my whole future life, and you can never know what was in my heart. Yes, Alyosha, tell your young lady not to be angry with me for what happened the day before yesterday. Nobody in the whole world knows what I'm going through now, and no one can ever know. For perhaps I shall take a knife with me today. I can't make up my mind.
And at this tragic phrase, Grushenka broke down, hid her face in her hands, flung herself on the sofa pillows, and sobbed like a little child. Alyosha got up and went to Rakitin.
Misha, he said, don't be angry. She wounded you, but don't be angry. You heard what she said just now. You mustn't ask too much of human endurance. One must be merciful.
Alyosha said this at the instinctive prompting of his heart. He felt obliged to speak, and he turned to Rakitin. If Rakitin had not been there, he would have spoken to the air, but Rakitin looked at him ironically, and Alyosha stopped short. You were so primed up with your elder's teaching last night that now you have to let it off on me, Alexei, man of God, said Rakitin with a smile of hatred.
Don't laugh, Rakitin, don't smile. Don't talk of the dead. He was better than anyone in the world, cried Alyosha with tears in his voice. I didn't speak to you as a judge, but as the lowest of the judged. What am I beside her? I came here seeking my ruin, and said to myself, what does it matter, in my cowardliness? But she, after 5 years in torment, as soon as anyone says a word from the heart to her, it makes her forget everything, forgive everything in her tears. The man who has wronged her has come back. He sends for her, and she forgives him everything and hastens joyfully to meet him. And she won't take a knife with her. She won't. No, I'm not like that. I don't know whether you are, Misha, but I'm not like that. It's a lesson to me. She is more loving than we. Have you heard her speak before of what she's just told us? No, you haven't. If you had, you'd have understood her long ago. And the person insulted the day before yesterday must forgive her too. She will, when she knows, and she shall know. This soul is not yet at peace with itself. One must be tender with it. There may be a treasure in that soul.
Alyosha stopped because he caught his breath. In spite of his ill humour, Rakitin looked at him with astonishment. He had never expected such a tirade from the gentle Alyosha. She's found someone to plead her cause. Why, are you in love with her? Agrafena Alexandrovna, our monk's really in love with you. You've made a conquest, he cried with a coarse laugh. Grushenka lifted her head from the pillow and looked at Alyosha with a tender smile shining on his tear-stained face.
Let him alone, Alyosha, my cherub. You see what he is. He's not a person for you to speak to. Mikhail Ospovich, she turned to Rakitin. I meant to beg your pardon for being rude to you, but now I don't want to. Alyosha, come to me, sit down here. She beckoned to him with a happy smile. That's right, sit here. Tell me. She took him by the hand and peeped into his face, smiling. Tell me, do I love that man or not? The man who wronged me, do I love him or not? Before you came, I lay here in the dark asking my heart whether I loved him. Decide for me, Alyosha, the time has come, it shall be as you say. Am I to forgive him or not? But you have forgiven him already, said Alyosha, smiling. Yes, I really have forgiven him. Grushenka murmured thoughtfully. What an abject heart. To my abject heart. She snatched up a glass from the table, emptied it at a gulp, lifted it in the air and flung it on the floor. The glass broke with a crash. A little cruel line came into her smile. Perhaps I haven't forgiven him, though, she said with a sort of menace in her voice, and she dropped her eyes to the ground as though she were talking to herself. Perhaps my heart is only getting ready to forgive. I shall struggle with my heart. You see, Alyosha, I've grown to love my tears in these 5 years. Perhaps I only love my resentment, not him. Well, I shouldn't care to be in his shoes, hissed Rakitin. Well, you won't be, Rakitin. You'll never be in his shoes. You shall black my shoes, Rakitin. That's the place you're fit for. You'll never get a woman like me. And he won't either, perhaps. Won't he? Then why are you dressed up like that? Said Rakitin with a venomous sneer. Don't taunt me with dressing up, Rakitin. You don't know all that is in my heart. If I choose to tear off my finery, I'll tear it off at once this minute, she cried in a resonant voice. You don't know what that finery is for, Rakitin. Perhaps I shall see him and say, have you ever seen me look like this before? He left me a thin, consumptive crybaby of 17. I'll sit by him, fascinate him and work him up. Do you see what I am like now? I'll say to him. Well, and that's enough for you, my dear sir. There's many a slip twixt the cup and the lip. That may be what the finery is for, Rakitin. Grushenka finished with a malicious laugh. I'm violent and resentful, Alyosha. I'll tear off my finery, I'll destroy my beauty, I'll scorch my face, slash it with a knife and turn beggar. If I choose, I won't go anywhere now to see anyone. If I choose, I'll send Kuzma back all he has ever given me tomorrow, and all his money, and I'll go out charring for the rest of my life. You think I wouldn't do it, Rakitin, that I would not dare do it? I would, I could do it directly, only don't exasperate me, and I'll send him about his business. I'll snap my fingers in his face. He shall never see me again. She uttered the last words in an hysterical scream, but broke down again, hid her face in her hands, buried it in the pillow, and shook with sobs. Rakitin got up. It's time we were off, he said. It's late, we should be shut out of the monastery. Grushenka leapt up from her place. Surely you don't want to go, Alyosha, she cried in mournful surprise. What are you doing to me? You've stirred up my feeling, tortured me, and now you'll leave me to face this night alone. He can hardly spend the night with you, though if he wants to, let him. I'll go alone. Rakitin scoffed jeeringly. Hush, evil tongue! Grushenka cried angrily at him. You never said such words to me as he has come to say. What's he said to you so special? Asked Rakitin irritably. I can't say, I don't know. I don't know what he said to me. It went straight to my heart. He has wrung my heart. He's the first, the only one who's pitied me. That's what it is. Why did you not come before, you angel? She fell on her knees before him as though in a sudden frenzy. I've been waiting all my life for someone like you. I knew that someone like you would come and forgive me. I believed that, nasty as I am, someone would really love me, not only with a shameful love. What have I done to you? Answered Alyosha, bending over her with a tender smile, and gently taking her by the hands. I only gave you an onion, nothing but a tiny little onion. That was all. He was moved to tears himself as he said it.
At that moment there was a sudden noise in the passage. Someone came into the hall. Grushenka jumped up, seeming greatly alarmed. Fenya ran noisily into the room, crying out, "Mistress, mistress, darling, a messenger has galloped up," she cried, breathless and joyful. "A carriage from Mokroe for you. Timofey, the driver, with 3 horses. They're just putting in fresh horses. A letter. Here's the letter, mistress." A letter was in her hand, and she waved it in the air all the while she talked. Grushenka snatched the letter from her and carried it to the candle. It was only a note, a few lines. She read it in one instant. "He has sent for me," she cried, her face white and distorted, with a wan smile. "He whistles. Crawl back, little dog." But only for one instant she stood, as though hesitating. Suddenly the blood rushed to her head and sent a glow to her cheeks. "I will go," she cried. "5 years of my life. Goodbye. Goodbye, Alyosha, my fate is sealed. Go, go. Leave me, all of you. Don't let me see you again. Grushenka is flying to a new life. Don't you remember evil against me either, Rakitin. I may be going to my death. Oh, I feel as though I were drunk." She suddenly left them and ran into her bedroom. "Well, she has no thoughts for us now," grumbled Rakitin. "Let's go, or we may hear that feminine shriek again. I'm sick of all these tears and cries." Alyosha mechanically let himself be led out. In the yard stood a covered cart. Horses were being taken out of the shafts. Men were running to and fro with a lantern. 3 fresh horses were being led in at the open gate. But when Alyosha and Rakitin reached the bottom of the steps, Grushenka's bedroom window was suddenly opened, and she called in a ringing voice after Alyosha, "Alyosha, give my greetings to your brother Mitya, and tell him not to remember evil against me, though I have brought him misery. And tell him, too, in my words, Grushenka has fallen to a scoundrel and not to you, noble heart. And add, too, that Grushenka loved him only 1 hour, only 1 short hour she loved him. So let him remember that hour all his life. Say, Grushenka tells you to." She ended in a voice full of sobs. The window was shut with a slam. Growled Rakitin, laughing. "She murders your brother Mitya and then tells him to remember it all his life. What ferocity!" Alyosha made no reply. He seemed not to have heard. He walked fast beside Rakitin as though in a terrible hurry. He was lost in thought and moved mechanically. Rakitin felt a sudden twinge, as though he'd been touched on an open wound. He had expected something quite different by bringing Grushenka and Alyosha together. Something very different from what he had hoped for had happened. "He is a Pole, that officer of hers," he began again, restraining himself. "And indeed, he's not an officer at all now. He served in the customs in Siberia, somewhere on the Chinese frontier. Some puny little beggar of a Pole, I expect. Lost his job, they say. He's heard now that Grushenka's saved a little money, so he's turned up again. That's the explanation of the mystery." Again Alyosha seemed not to hear. Rakitin could not control himself. "Well, so you've saved the sinner," he laughed spitefully. "Have you turned the Magdalene into the true path? Driven out the 7 devils, eh? So you see the miracles you were looking out for just now have come to pass." "Hush, Rakitin," Alyosha answered with an aching heart. "So you despise me now for those 25 roubles. I've sold my friend, you think. But you're not Christ, you know, and I'm not Judas." "Oh, Rakitin, I assure you I'd forgotten about it," cried Alyosha. "You remind me of it yourself." But this was the last straw for Rakitin. "Damnation take you all and each of you!" he cried suddenly. "Why the devil did I take you up? I don't want to know you from this time forward. Go alone. There's your road." And he turned abruptly into another street, leaving Alyosha alone in the dark. Alyosha came out of the town and walked across the fields to the monastery. Chapter 4. Cana of Galilee. It was very late, according to the monastery ideas, when Alyosha returned to the hermitage. The doorkeeper let him in by a special entrance. It had struck 9 o'clock, the hour of rest and repose after a day of such agitation for all. Alyosha timidly opened the door and went into the elder's cell, where his coffin was now standing. There was no one in the cell but Father Paisi, reading the Gospel in solitude over the coffin, and the young novice, Porphyry, who, exhausted by the previous night's conversation and the disturbing incidents of the day, was sleeping the deep, sound sleep of youth on the floor of the other room. Though Father Païssy heard Alyosha come in, he did not even look in his direction. Alyosha turned to the right from the door to the corner, fell on his knees and began to pray. His soul was overflowing, but with mingled feelings. No single sensation stood out distinctly. On the contrary, one drove out another in a slow, continual rotation. But there was a sweetness in his heart, and, strange to say, Alyosha was not surprised at it. Again he saw that coffin before him, the hidden, dead figure so precious to him. But the weeping and poignant grief of the morning was no longer aching in his soul. As soon as he came in, he fell down before the coffin as before a holy shrine. But joy was glowing in his mind and in his heart. The one window of the cell was open, the air was fresh and cool.
"So the smell must have become stronger if they opened the window," thought Alyosha.
But even this thought of the smell of corruption, which had seemed to him so awful and humiliating a few hours before, no longer made him feel miserable or indignant. He began quietly praying, but he soon felt that he was praying almost mechanically. Fragments of thought floated through his soul, flashed like stars and went out again at once, to be succeeded by others. But yet there was reigning in his soul a sense of the wholeness of things, something steadfast and comforting, and he was aware of it himself. Sometimes he began praying ardently. He longed to pour out his thankfulness and love. But when he had begun to pray, he passed suddenly to something else and sank into thought, forgetting both the prayer and what had interrupted it. He began listening to what Father Païssy was reading, but worn out with exhaustion, he gradually began to doze. "And the third day there was a marriage in Cana of Galilee," read Father Païssy, "and the mother of Jesus was there, and both Jesus was called and his disciples to the marriage."
"Marriage? What's that? A marriage?" floated whirling through Alyosha's mind. "There is happiness for her, too. She's gone to the feast. No, she's not taken the knife. That was only a tragic phrase. Well, tragic phrases should be forgiven, there must be. Tragic phrases comfort the heart. Without them, sorrow would be too heavy for men to bear. Rakitin has gone off to the back alley. As long as Rakitin broods over his wrongs, he will always go off to the back alley. But the high road, the road is wide and straight and bright as crystal, and the sun is at the end of it. Ah, what's being read?"
"And when they wanted wine, the mother of Jesus saith unto him, They have no wine,"
Alyosha heard. "Oh, yes, I was missing that, and I didn't want to miss it. I love that passage. It's Cana of Galilee, the first miracle. Ah, that miracle! Ah, that sweet miracle! It was not men's grief, but their joy Christ visited. He worked his first miracle to help men's gladness. He who loves men loves their gladness too. He was always repeating that. It was one of his leading ideas. There's no living without joy, Mitya says. Yes, Mitya.
Everything that is true and good is always full of forgiveness.
He used to say that too.
Jesus saith unto her, Woman, what has it to do with thee or me? Mine hour is not yet come. His mother saith unto the servants, Whatsoever he saith unto you, do it.
Do it. Gladness. The gladness of some poor, very poor people. Of course they were poor, since they hadn't wine enough even at a wedding.
The historians write that in those days the people living about the Lake of Gennesaret were the poorest that can possibly be imagined. And another great heart, that other great being, his mother, knew that he'd come not only to make his great, terrible sacrifice. She knew that his heart was open even to the simple, artless merry-making of some obscure and unlearned people, who had warmly bidden him to their poor wedding. Mine hour is not yet come, he said with a soft smile. He must have smiled gently to her. And indeed, was it to make wine abundant at poor weddings he had come down to earth? And yet he went, and did as she asked him.
Ah, he's reading again.
Jesus saith unto them, Fill the water pots with water, and they filled them up to the brim. And he saith unto them, Draw out now, and bear unto the governor of the feast, and they bare it.
When the ruler of the feast had tasted the water that was made wine, and knew not whence it was, but the servants which drew the water knew, the governor of the feast called the bridegroom, and saith unto him, Every man at the beginning doth set forth good wine, and when men have well drunk, that which is worse. But thou hast kept the good wine until now.
But what's this? What's this? Why is the room growing wider? Ah, yes, it's the marriage, the wedding. Yes, of course. Here are the guests. Here are the young couple sitting in the merry crowd, and where is the wise governor of the feast? But who is this? Who? Again the walls are receding. Who is getting up there from the great table? What? He? Here, too? But he's in the coffin. But he's here, too. He has stood up. He sees me. He is coming here. God!
Yes, he came up to him. To him, he, the little thin old man with tiny wrinkles on his face, joyful and laughing softly. There was no coffin now, and he was in the same dress as he had worn yesterday sitting with them when the visitors had gathered about him. His face was uncovered. His eyes were shining. How was this, then? He, too, had been called to the feast. He, too, at the marriage of Cana in Galilee. Yes, my dear, I'm called too, called and bidden. He heard a soft voice saying over him, Why have you hidden yourself here out of sight? You come and join us too.
It was his voice, the voice of Father Zosima, and it must be he, since he called him. The elder raised Alyosha by the hand, and he rose from his knees.
We are rejoicing, the little thin old man went on. We are drinking the new wine, the wine of new great gladness. Do you see how many guests? Here are the bride and bridegroom. Here is the wise governor of the feast. He is tasting the new wine. Why do you wonder at me? I gave an onion to a beggar, so I, too, am here. And many here have given only an onion each, only one little onion. What are all our deeds? And you, my gentle one, you, my kind boy, you too have known how to give a famished woman an onion today. Begin your work, dear one, begin it, gentle one. Do you see our son? Do you see him?
I'm afraid I dare not look, whispered Alyosha.
Do not fear him. He is terrible in his greatness, awful in his sublimity, but infinitely merciful. He has made himself like unto us from love, and rejoices with us. He is changing the water into wine, that the gladness of the guests may not be cut short. He is expecting new guests. He is calling new ones unceasingly for ever and ever. There they are, bringing new wine. Do you see, they're bringing the vessels?
Something glowed in Alyosha's heart. Something filled it till it ached. Tears of rapture rose from his soul. He stretched out his hands, uttered a cry, and waked up. Again the coffin, the open window, and the soft, solemn, distinct reading of the Gospel. But Alyosha did not listen to the reading. It was strange, he'd fallen asleep on his knees. But now he was on his feet, and suddenly, as though thrown forward, with 3 firm, rapid steps he went right up to the coffin. His shoulder brushed against Father Païssy without his noticing it. Father Païssy raised his eyes for an instant from his book, but looked away again at once, seeing that something strange was happening to the boy. Alyosha gazed for half a minute at the coffin, at the covered, motionless, dead man that lay in the coffin, with the icon on his breast and the peaked cap with the octangular cross on his head. He had only just been hearing his voice, and that voice was still ringing in his ears. He was listening, still expecting other words, but suddenly he turned sharply and went out of the cell. He did not stop on the steps either, but went quickly down. His soul, overflowing with rapture, yearned for freedom, space, openness. The vault of heaven, full of soft, shining stars, stretched vast and fathomless above him. The Milky Way ran in 2 pale streams from the zenith to the horizon. The fresh, motionless, still night enfolded the earth. The white towers and golden domes of the cathedral gleamed out against the sapphire sky. The gorgeous autumn flowers in the beds round the house were slumbering till morning.
The silence of earth seemed to melt into the silence of the heavens. The mystery of earth was one with the mystery of the stars. Alyosha stood, gazed, and suddenly threw himself down on the earth. He did not know why he embraced it. He could not have told why he longed so irresistibly to kiss it all. But he kissed it, weeping, sobbing, and watering it with his tears, and vowed passionately to love it for ever and ever. "Water the earth with the tears of your joy, and love those tears," echoed in his soul. What was he weeping over? Oh, in his rapture he was weeping even over those stars which were shining to him from the abyss of space, and he was not ashamed of that ecstasy. There seemed to be threads from all those innumerable worlds of God, liking his soul to them, and it was trembling all over, in contact with other worlds. He longed to forgive everyone and for everything, and to beg forgiveness. Oh, not for himself, but for all men, for all and for everything. "And others are praying for me too," echoed again in his soul. But with every instant he felt clearly, and as it were tangibly, that something firm and unshakable as that vault of heaven had entered into his soul. It was as though some idea had seized the sovereignty of his mind, and it was for all his life, and for ever and ever. He had fallen on the earth a weak boy, but he rose up a resolute champion, and he knew and felt it suddenly at the very moment of his ecstasy. And never, never, all his life long, could Alyosha forget that minute. "Someone visited my soul in that hour," he used to say afterwards, with implicit faith in his words. Within 3 days he left the monastery in accordance with the words of his elder, who had bidden him sojourn in the world. Part 3, Book 8, Mitya. Chapter 1, Kuzma Samsonov. But Dmitri, to whom Grushenka, flying away to a new life, had left her last greetings, bidding him remember the hour of her love forever, knew nothing of what had happened to her, and was at that moment in a condition of feverish agitation and activity. For the last 2 days he had been in such an inconceivable state of mind that he might easily have fallen ill with brain fever, as he said himself afterwards. Alyosha had not been able to find him the morning before, and Ivan had not succeeded in meeting him at the tavern on the same day. The people at his lodgings, by his orders, concealed his movements. He had spent those 2 days literally rushing in all directions, struggling with his destiny and trying to save himself, as he expressed it himself afterwards, and for some hours he even made a dash out of the town on urgent business, terrible as it was to him to lose sight of Grushenka for a moment. All this was explained afterwards in detail and confirmed by documentary evidence, but for the present we will only note the most essential incidents of those 2 terrible days immediately preceding the awful catastrophe that broke so suddenly upon him. Though Grushenka had, it is true, loved him for an hour, genuinely and sincerely, yet she tortured him sometimes cruelly and mercilessly. The worst of it was that he could never tell what she meant to do. To prevail upon her by force or kindness was also impossible. She would yield to nothing. She would only have become angry and turned away from him altogether. He knew that well already. He suspected, quite correctly, that she too was passing through an inward struggle, and was in a state of extraordinary indecision, that she was making up her mind to something, and unable to determine upon it. And so, not without good reason, he divined, with a sinking heart, that at moments she must simply hate him and his passion. And so perhaps it was, but what was distressing Grushenka he did not understand. For him the whole tormenting question lay between him and Fyodor Pavlovitch. Here we must note, by the way, one certain fact. He was firmly persuaded that Fyodor Pavlovitch would offer, or perhaps had offered, Grushenka lawful wedlock, and did not for a moment believe that the old voluptuary hoped to gain his object for 3,000 roubles. Mitya had reached this conclusion from his knowledge of Grushenka and her character. That was how it was that he could believe at times that all Grushenka's uneasiness rose from not knowing which of them to choose, which was most to her advantage. Strange to say, during those days it never occurred to him to think of the approaching return of the officer, that is, of the man who had been such a fatal influence in Grushenka's life, and whose arrival she was expecting with such emotion and dread. It is true that of late Grushenka had been very silent about it. Yet he was perfectly aware of a letter she had received a month ago from her seducer, and had heard of it from her own lips. He partly knew, too, what the letter contained. In a moment of spite, Grushenka had shown him that letter, but to her astonishment he attached hardly any consequence to it. It would be hard to say why this was. Perhaps, weighed down by all the hideous horror of his struggle with his own father for this woman, he was incapable of imagining any danger more terrible, at any rate for the time. He simply did not believe in a suitor who suddenly turned up again after 5 years' disappearance, still less in his speedy arrival. Moreover, in the officer's first letter, which had been shown to Mitya, the possibility of his new rival's visit was very vaguely suggested. The letter was very indefinite, high-flown, and full of sentimentality. It must be noted that Grushenka had concealed from him the last lines of the letter in which his return was alluded to more definitely. He had, besides, noticed at that moment, he remembered afterwards, a certain involuntary proud contempt for this missive from Siberia on Grushenka's face. Grushenka had told him nothing of what had passed later between her and this rival, so that by degrees he had completely forgotten the officer's existence. He felt that whatever might come later, whatever turn things might take, his final conflict with Fyodor Pavlovitch was close upon him, and must be decided before anything else. With a sinking heart, he was expecting every moment Grushenka's decision, always believing that it would come suddenly, on the impulse of the moment. All of a sudden she would say to him, "Take me, I'm yours forever," and it would all be over. He would seize her and bear her away at once to the ends of the earth. Oh, then he would bear her away at once, as far, far away as possible, to the furthest end of Russia, if not of the earth. Then he would marry her, and settle down with her incognito, so that no one would know anything about them, there, here, or anywhere. Then, oh then, a new life would begin at once. Of this different, reformed, and virtuous life, it must be virtuous. He dreamed feverishly at every moment. He thirsted for that reformation and renewal. The filthy morass in which he'd sunk of his own free will was too revolting to him, and, like very many men in such cases, he put faith above all in change of place. If only it were not for these people, if only it were not for these circumstances, if only he could fly away from this accursed place, he would be altogether regenerated, would enter on a new path. That was what he believed in, and for what he was yearning. But all this could only be on condition of the first, the happy, solution of the question. There was another possibility, a different and awful ending. Suddenly she might say to him, "Go away, I've just come to terms with Fyodor Pavlovitch, I'm going to marry him and don't want you." And then, But Mitya did not know what would happen then. Up to the last hour he didn't know. That must be said to his credit. He had no definite intentions, had planned no crime. He was simply watching and spying in agony, while he prepared himself for the first happy solution of his destiny. He drove away any other idea, in fact, but for that ending a quite different anxiety arose. A new, incidental, but yet fatal and insoluble difficulty presented itself. If she were to say to him, "I'm yours, take me away," how could he take her away? Where had he the means, the money to do it? It was just at this time that all sources of revenue from Fyodor Pavlovitch, doles which had gone on without interruption for so many years, ceased. Grushenka had money, of course, but with regard to this Mitya suddenly evinced extraordinary pride. He wanted to carry her away and begin the new life with her himself at his own expense, not at hers. He could not conceive of taking her money, and the very idea caused him a pang of intense repulsion. I won't enlarge on this fact or analyze it here, but confine myself to remarking that this was his attitude at the moment. All this may have arisen indirectly and unconsciously from the secret stings of his conscience for the money of Katerina Ivanovna that he had dishonestly appropriated. "I've been a scoundrel to one of them, and I shall be a scoundrel again to the other directly," with his feeling then, as he explained after. "And when Grushenka knows, she won't care for such a scoundrel." Where, then, was he to get the means? Where was he to get the fateful money? Without it, all would be lost, and nothing could be done. And only because I hadn't the money. Oh, the shame of it! To anticipate things, he did perhaps know where to get the money, knew perhaps where it lay at that moment. I will say no more of this here, as it will all be clear later. But his chief trouble, I must explain, however obscurely, lay in the fact that to have the sum he knew of, to have the right to take it, he must first restore Katerina Ivanovna's 3,000. If not, I'm a common pickpocket, I'm a scoundrel, and I don't want to begin a new life as a scoundrel, Mitya decided. And so he made up his mind to move heaven and earth to return Katerina Ivanovna that 3,000, and that first of all. The final stage of this decision, so to say, had been reached only during the last hours. That is, after his last interview with Alyosha 2 days before, on the high road, on the evening when Grushenka had insulted Katerina Ivanovna, and Mitya, after hearing Alyosha's account of it, had admitted that he was a scoundrel, and told him to tell Katerina Ivanovna so, if it could be any comfort to her. After parting from his brother on that night, he had felt in his frenzy that it would be better to murder and rob someone than fail to pay my debt to Katya. I'd rather everyone thought me a robber and a murderer. I'd rather go to Siberia than that Katya should have the right to say that I deceived her and stole her money, and used her money to run away with Grushenka and begin a new life. That I can't do." So Mitya decided, grinding his teeth, and he might well fancy at times that his brain would give way. But meanwhile he went on struggling. Strange to say, though one would have supposed there was nothing left for him but despair, for what chance had he, with nothing in the world, to raise such a sum? Yet to the very end he persisted in hoping that he would get that 3,000, that the money would somehow come to him, of itself, as though it might drop from heaven. That is just how it is with people who, like Dmitri, have never had anything to do with money, except to squander what had come to them by inheritance, without any effort of their own, and have no notion how money is obtained. A whirl of the most fantastic notions took possession of his brain, immediately after he had parted with Alyosha 2 days before, and threw his thoughts into a tangle of confusion. This is how it was he pitched first on a perfectly wild enterprise, and, perhaps, to men of that kind in such circumstances, the most impossible, fantastic schemes occur first, and seem most practical. He suddenly determined to go to Samsonov, the merchant who was Grushenka's protector, and to propose a scheme to him, and by means of it to obtain from him at once the whole of the sum required. Of the commercial value of his scheme he had no doubt, not the slightest, and was only uncertain how Samsonov would look upon his freak, supposing he were to consider it from any but the commercial point of view. Though Mitya knew the merchant by sight, he was not acquainted with him, and had never spoken a word to him. But for some unknown reason he had long entertained the conviction that the old reprobate, who was lying at death's door, would perhaps not at all object now to Grushenka's securing a respectable position, and marrying a man to be depended upon. And he believed not only that he would not object, but that this was what he desired, and, if opportunity arose, that he would be ready to help. From some rumour, or perhaps from some stray words of Grushenka's, he had gathered further that the old man would perhaps prefer him to Fyodor Pavlovitch for Grushenka. Possibly many of the readers of my novel will feel that in reckoning on such assistance, and being ready to take his bride, so to speak, from the hands of her protector, Dmitri showed great coarseness and want of delicacy. I will only observe that Mitya looked upon Grushenka's past as something completely over. He looked on that past with infinite pity, and resolved with all the fervour of his passion that when once Grushenka told him she loved him and would marry him, it would mean the beginning of a new Grushenka and a new Dmitri, free from every vice. They would forgive one another and would begin their lives afresh. As for Kuzma Samsonov, Dmitri looked upon him as a man who had exercised a fateful influence in that remote past of Grushenka's, though she had never loved him, and who was now himself a thing of the past, completely done with, and, so to say, non-existent. Besides, Mitya hardly looked upon him as a man at all, for it was known to everyone in the town that he was only a shattered wreck, whose relations with Grushenka had changed their character and were now simply paternal, and that this had been so for a long time. In any case, there was much simplicity on Mitya's part in all this, for in spite of all his vices, he was a very simple-hearted man. It was an instance of this simplicity that Mitya was seriously persuaded that, being on the eve of his departure for the next world, old Kuzma must sincerely repent of his past relations with Grushenka, and that she had no more devoted friend and protector in the world than this, now harmless, old man. After his conversation with Alyosha at the crossroads, he hardly slept all night, and at 10 o'clock next morning he was at the house of Samsonov and telling the servant to announce him. It was a very large and gloomy old house of 2 stories, with a lodge and outhouses. In the lower story lived Samsonov's 2 married sons with their families, his old sister and his unmarried daughter. In the lodge lived 2 of his clerks, one of whom also had a large family. Both the lodge and the lower story were overcrowded, but the old man kept the upper floor to himself, and would not even let the daughter live there with him, though she waited upon him, and in spite of her asthma was obliged at certain fixed hours, and at any time he might call her, to run upstairs to him from below. This upper floor contained a number of large rooms kept purely for show, furnished in the old-fashioned merchant style, with long, monotonous rows of clumsy mahogany chairs along the walls, with glass chandeliers under shades, and gloomy mirrors on the walls. All these rooms were entirely empty and unused, but the old man kept to one room, a small remote bedroom, where he was waited upon by an old servant with a kerchief on her head, and by a lad who used to sit on the locker in the passage. Owing to his swollen legs, the old man could hardly walk at all, and was only rarely lifted from his leather armchair, when the old woman supporting him led him up and down the room once or twice. He was morose and taciturn even with this old woman. When he was informed of the arrival of the captain, he at once refused to see him, but Mitya persisted and sent his name up again. Samsonov questioned the lad minutely, what he looked like, whether he was drunk, was he going to make a row. The answer he received was that he was sober, but wouldn't go away. The old man again refused to see him. Then Mitya, who had foreseen this and purposely brought pencil and paper with him, wrote clearly on the piece of paper the words, "On most important business closely concerning Agrafena Alexandrovna," and sent it up to the old man. After thinking a little, Samsonov told the lad to take the visitor to the drawing-room, and sent the old woman downstairs with the summons to his younger son to come upstairs to him at once. The younger son, a man over 6 foot, and of exceptional physical strength, who was closely shaven and dressed in the European style, though his father still wore a caftan and a beard, came at once without a comment. All the family trembled before the father. The old man had sent for this giant, not because he was afraid of the captain — he was by no means of a timorous temper — but in order to have a witness in case of an emergency. Supported by his son and the servant lad, he waddled at last into the drawing-room. It may be assumed that he felt considerable curiosity. The drawing-room in which Mitya was awaiting him was a vast, dreary room that laid a weight of depression on the heart. It had a double row of windows, a gallery, marbled walls, and 3 immense chandeliers with glass lustres covered with shades. Mitya was sitting on a little chair at the entrance, awaiting his fate with nervous impatience. When the old man appeared at the opposite door, 70 feet away, Mitya jumped up at once, and with his long military stride, walked to meet him. Mitya was well dressed, in a frock coat, buttoned up, with a round hat and black gloves in his hands, just as he had been 3 days before at the elders', at the family meeting with his father and brothers. The old man waited for him, standing, dignified and unbending, and Mitya felt at once that he had looked him through and through as he advanced. Mitya was greatly impressed, too, with Samsonov's immensely swollen face. His lower lip, which had always been thick, hung down now, looking like a bun. He bowed to his guest in dignified silence, motioned him to a low chair by the sofa, and leaning on his son's arm he began lowering himself onto the sofa opposite, groaning painfully, so that Mitya, seeing his painful exertions, immediately felt remorseful and sensitively conscious of his insignificance in the presence of the dignified person he had ventured to disturb. "What is it you want of me, sir?" said the old man, deliberately, distinctly, severely, but courteously, when he was at last seated. Mitya started, leapt up, but sat down again. Then he began at once speaking with loud, nervous haste, gesticulating, and in a positive frenzy. He was unmistakably a man driven into a corner, on the brink of ruin, catching at the last straw, ready to sink if he failed. Old Samsonov probably grasped all this in an instant, though his face remained cold and immovable as a statue's. "Most honoured sir, Kuzma Kuzmich, you have no doubt heard more than once of my dispute with my father, Fyodor Pavlovich Karamazov, who robbed me of my inheritance from my mother, seeing the whole town is gossiping about it. For here everyone's gossiping of what they shouldn't. And besides, it might have reached through Grishenka. I beg your pardon, through Agrafena Alexandrovna. Agrafena Alexandrovna, the lady for whom I have the highest respect and esteem." So Mitya began and broke down at the first sentence. We will not reproduce his speech word for word, but will only summarize the gist of it. 3 months ago he said he had of express intention. Mitya purposely used these words instead of intentionally. Consulted a lawyer in the chief town of the province, a distinguished lawyer, Kuzma Kuzmich Pavel Pavlovich Korneplodov. You have perhaps heard of him, a man of vast intellect, the mind of a statesman. He knows you too, spoke of you in the highest terms." Mitya broke down again, but these breaks did not deter him. He leapt instantly over the gaps and struggled on and on. This Korneplodov, after questioning him minutely and inspecting the documents he was able to bring, Mitya alluded somewhat vaguely to these documents and slurred over the subject with special haste, reported that they certainly might take proceedings concerning the village of Chermashnya, which ought, he said, to have come to him, Mitya, from his mother, and so checkmate the old villain his father, because every door was not closed and justice might still find a loophole. In fact, he might reckon on an additional sum of 6 or even 7,000 roubles from Fyodor Pavlovich, as Chermashnya was worth at least 25,000. He might say 28,000, in fact. 30, Kuzma Kuzmich, and would you believe it, I didn't get 17 from that heartless man?" So he, Mitya, had thrown the business up for the time, knowing nothing about the law, but on coming here was struck dumb by a cross-claim made upon him. Here Mitya went adrift again, and again took a flying leap forward. "So will not you, excellent and honoured Kuzma Kuzmich, be willing to take up all my claims against that unnatural monster and pay me a sum down of only 3,000? You see, you cannot in any case lose over it. On my honour, I swear that. Quite the contrary, you may make 6 or 7,000 instead of 3. Above all, he wanted this concluded that very day. "I'll do the business with you at a notary's, or whatever it is. In fact, I'm ready to do anything. I'll hand over all the deeds, whatever you want, sign anything, and we could draw up the agreement at once, and if it were only possible that very morning. You could pay me that 3,000, for there isn't a capitalist in this town to compare with you, and so would save me, in fact, for a good, I might say an honourable action. For I cherish the most honourable feelings for a certain person whom you know well, and care for as a father,
I would not have come, indeed, if it had not been as a father. And indeed, it's a struggle of three in this business for its fate. That's a fearful thing, Kuzma Kuzmich. A tragedy, Kuzma Kuzmich, a tragedy. And as you've dropped out long ago, it's a tug-of-war between two. I'm expressing it awkwardly, perhaps, but I'm not a literary man. You see, I'm on the one side, and the monster on the other. So you must choose. It's either I or the monster. It all lies in your hands, the fate of 3 lives and the happiness of 2. Excuse me, I'm making a mess of it, but you understand. I see from your venerable eyes that you understand. And if you don't understand, I'm done for. So you see."
Mitya broke off his clumsy speech with that, "So you see," and jumping up from his seat awaited the answer to his foolish proposal. At the last phrase he had suddenly become hopelessly aware that it had all fallen flat. Above all, that he had been talking utter nonsense. How strange it is, on the way here it seemed all right, and now it's nothing but nonsense. The idea suddenly dawned on his despairing mind. All the while he'd been talking, the old man sat motionless, watching him with an icy expression in his eyes. After keeping him for a moment in suspense, Kuzma Kuzmich pronounced at last in the most positive and chilling tone, "Excuse me, we don't undertake such business." Mitya suddenly felt his legs growing weak under him. "What am I to do now, Kuzma Kuzmich?" he muttered with a pale smile. "I suppose it's all up with me. What do you think?" "Excuse me." Mitya remained standing, staring, motionless. He suddenly noticed a movement in the old man's face. He started. "You see, sir, business of that sort's not in our line," said the old man slowly. "There's the court and the lawyers. It's a perfect misery. But if you like, there is a man here you might apply to." "Good heavens, who is it? You're my salvation, Kuzma Kuzmich," faltered Mitya. "He doesn't live here, and he's not here just now. He is a peasant. He does business in timber. His name is Lyagavi. He's been haggling with Fyodor Pavlovitch for the last year over your copse at Chermashnya. They can't agree on the price, maybe you've heard. Now he's come back again and is staying with the priest at Ilyenskoye, about 12 versts from the Volovya station. He wrote to me, too, about the business of the copse, asking my advice. Fyodor Pavlovitch means to go and see him himself. So if you were to be beforehand with Fyodor Pavlovitch and to make Lyagavi the offer you've made me, he might possibly— A brilliant idea!" Mitya interrupted ecstatically. "He's the very man it would just suit him. He's haggling with him for it, being asked too much, and here he would have all the documents entitling him to the property itself. Ha, ha!" And Mitya suddenly went off into his short wooden laugh, startling Samsonov. "How can I thank you, Kuzma Kuzmich?" cried Mitya effusively. "Don't mention it," said Samsonov, inclining his head. "But you don't know you've saved me. Oh, it was a true presentiment brought me to you. So now, to this priest. No need of thanks. I'll make haste and fly there. I'm afraid I've overtaxed your strength. I shall never forget it. It's a Russian says that, Kuzma Kuzmich. A Russian. To be sure." Mitya seized his hand to press it, but there was a malignant gleam in the old man's eye. Mitya drew back his hand, but at once blamed himself for his mistrustfulness. "It's because he's tired," he thought. For her sake, Kuzma Kuzmich. You understand that it's for her," he cried, his voice ringing through the room. He bowed, turned sharply round, and with the same long stride walked to the door without looking back. He was trembling with delight. "Everything was on the verge of ruin, and my guardian angel saved me," was the thought in his mind. And if such a businessman as Samsonov, a most worthy old man and what dignity, had suggested this course, then success was assured. He would fly off immediately. "I'll be back before night, I shall be back at night, and the thing is done. Could the old man have been laughing at me?" exclaimed Mitya as he strode towards his lodging. He could, of course, imagine nothing but that the advice was practical from such a businessman, with an understanding of the business, with an understanding of this Lyagavi, curious surname, or the old man was laughing at him. Alas, the second alternative was the correct one. Long afterwards, when the catastrophe had happened, old Samsonov himself confessed, laughing, that he'd made a fool of the captain. He was a cold, spiteful and sarcastic man, liable to violent antipathies, whether it was the captain's excited face, or the foolish conviction of the rake-and spendthrift, that he, Samsonov, could be taken in by such a cock-and-bull story as his scheme, or jealousy over Grushenka, in whose name this scapegrace had rushed in on him with such a tale to get money. Which worked on the old man, I can't tell. But at the instant when Mitya stood before him, feeling his legs grow weak under him, and frantically exclaiming that he was ruined, at that moment the old man looked at him with intense spite, and resolved to make a laughing-stock of him. When Mitya had gone, Kuzma Kuzmich, white with rage, turned to his son and bade him see to it that that beggar be never seen again, and never admitted even into the yard, or else he'd— He did not utter his threat, but even his son, who often saw him enraged, trembled with fear. For a whole hour afterwards the old man was shaking with anger, and by evening he was worse, and sent for the doctor. Chapter 2. Liagavi. So he must drive at full speed, and he had not the money for horses. He had 40 kopecks, and that was all that was left after so many years of prosperity. But he had at home an old silver watch which had long ceased to go. He snatched it up and carried it to a Jewish watchmaker who had a shop in the marketplace. The Jew gave him 6 roubles for it. "And I didn't expect that," cried Mitya ecstatically. He was still in a state of ecstasy. He seized his 6 roubles and ran home. At home he borrowed 3 roubles from the people of the house, who loved him so much that they were pleased to give it him, though it was all they had. Mitya in his excitement told them on the spot that his fate would be decided that day, and he described in desperate haste the whole scheme he had put before Samsonov, the latter's decision, his own hopes for the future, and so on. These people had been told many of their lodger's secrets before, and so looked upon him as a gentleman who was not at all proud, and almost one of themselves. Having thus collected 9 roubles, Mitya sent for posting horses to take him to the Volovya station. This was how the fact came to be remembered and established that, at midday on the day before the event, Mitya had not a farthing, and that he had sold his watch to get money and had borrowed 3 roubles from his landlords, all in the presence of witnesses. I note this fact. Later on it will be apparent why I do so. Though he was radiant with the joyful anticipation that he would at last solve all his difficulties, yet, as he drew near Volovya station, he trembled at the thought of what Grushenka might be doing in his absence. What if she made up her mind today to go to Fyodor Pavlovitch? This was why he'd gone off without telling her, and why he left orders with his landlady not to let out where he'd gone, if anyone came to inquire for him. I must get back tonight," he repeated as he was jolted along the cart, "and I dare say I shall have to bring this Liagavi back here to draw up the deed." So mused Mitya with a throbbing heart. But alas, his dreams were not fated to be carried out. To begin with, he was late, taking a short cut from Volovya station, which turned out to be 18 versts instead of 12. Secondly, he did not find the priest at home at Ilyenskoye. He'd gone off to a neighbouring village. While Mitya, setting off there with the same exhausted horses, was looking for him, it was almost dark. The priest, a shy and amiable-looking little man, informed him at once that, though Liagavi had been staying with him at first, he was now at Suhoy Posiolok, that he was staying the night in the forester's cottage, as he was buying timber there, too. At Mitya's urgent request that he would take him to Liagavi at once, and by so doing save him, so to speak, the priest agreed, after some demur, to conduct him to Suhoy Posiolok. His curiosity was obviously aroused, but unluckily he advised their going on foot, as it would not be much over a verst. Mitya, of course, agreed, and marched off with his yard-long strides, so that the poor priest almost ran after him. He was a very cautious man, though not old. Mitya at once began talking to him, too, of his plans, nervously and excitedly asking advice in regard to Liagavi, and talking all the way. He turned off Mitya's questions with, "I don't know, I can't say, how can I tell?" and so on. When Mitya began to speak of his quarrel with his father over his inheritance, the priest was positively alarmed, as he was in some way dependent on Fyodor Pavlovitch. He inquired, however, with surprise, why he called the peasant trader Gorstkin, Lyagavy, and obligingly explained to Mitya that though the man's name really was Lyagavy, he was never called so, as he would be grievously offended at the name, and that he must be sure to call him Gorstkin. "Or you'll do nothing with him, he won't even listen to you," said the priest in conclusion. Mitya was somewhat surprised for a moment, and explained that that was what Samsonov had called him. On hearing this fact, the priest dropped the subject, though he would have done well to put into words his doubt whether, if Samsonov had sent him to that peasant, calling him Lyagavy, there was not something wrong about it, and he was turning him into ridicule. But Mitya had no time to pause over such trifles. He hurried, striding along, and only when he reached Suhoy Posyolok he realized that they had come not 1 verst, nor 1.5, but at least 3. This annoyed him, but he controlled himself. They went into the hut. The forester lived in one half of the hut, and Gorstkin was lodging in the other, the better room the other side of the passage. They went into that room and lighted a tallow candle. The hut was extremely overheated. On the table there was a samovar that had gone out, a tray with cups, an empty rum bottle, a bottle of vodka partly full, and some half-eaten crusts of wheaten bread. The visitor himself lay stretched at full length on the bench, with his coat crushed up under his head for a pillow, snoring heavily. Mitya stood in perplexity. "Of course I must wake him. My business is too important. I've come in such haste. I'm in a hurry to get back today," he said in great agitation. But the priest and the forester stood in silence, not giving their opinion. Mitya went up and began trying to wake him himself. He tried vigorously, but the sleeper did not wake. "He's drunk," Mitya decided. "Good Lord, what am I to do? What am I to do?" And terribly impatient he began pulling him by the arms, by the legs, shaking his head, lifting him up and making him sit on the bench. Yet, after prolonged exertions, he could only succeed in getting the drunken man to utter absurd grunts and violent but inarticulate oaths. "No, you'd better wait a little," the priest pronounced at last, "for he's obviously not in a fit state." "He's been drinking the whole day," the forester chimed in. "Good heavens!" cried Mitya. "If only you knew how important it is to me and how desperate I am." "No, you'd better wait till morning," the priest repeated. "Till morning? Mercy, that's impossible." And in his despair he was on the point of attacking the sleeping man again, but stopped short at once, realizing the uselessness of his efforts. The priest said nothing. The sleepy forester looked gloomy. "What terrible tragedies real life contrives for people," said Mitya in complete despair. The perspiration was streaming down his face. The priest seized the moment to put before him, very reasonably, that even if he succeeded in wakening the man, he would still be drunk and incapable of conversation. "And your business is important," he said, "so you'd certainly better put it off till morning." With a gesture of despair, Mitya agreed. "Father, I will stay here with the light, and seize the favourable moment. As soon as he wakes, I'll begin. I'll pay you for the light," he said to the forester, "for the night's lodging, too. You'll remember Dmitri Karamazov. Only, Father, I don't know what we're to do with you. Where will you sleep?" "No, I'm going home. I'll take his horse and get home," he said, indicating the forester. "And now I'll say good-bye. I wish you all success." So it was settled. The priest rode off on the forester's horse, delighted to escape, though he shook his head uneasily, wondering whether he ought not next day to inform his benefactor Fyodor Pavlovitch of this curious incident. Or he may, in an unlucky hour, hear of it, be angry, and withdraw his favour. The forester, scratching himself, went back to his room without a word, and Mitya sat on the bench to catch the favourable moment, as he expressed it. Profound dejection clung about his soul like a heavy mist, a profound, intense dejection. He sat thinking, but could reach no conclusion. The candle burnt dimly, a cricket chirped. It became insufferably close in the overheated room. He suddenly pictured the garden, the path behind the garden, the door of his father's house mysteriously opening, and Grushenka running in. He leapt up from the bench. "It's a tragedy!" he said, grinding his teeth. Mechanically he went up to the sleeping man and looked in his face. He was a lean, middle-aged peasant with a very long face, flaxen curls, and a long, thin, reddish beard, wearing a blue cotton shirt and a black waistcoat, from the pocket of which peeped the chain of a silver watch. Mitya looked at his face with intense hatred, and for some unknown reason his curly hair particularly irritated him. What was insufferably humiliating was that, after leaving things of such importance and making such sacrifices, he, Mitya, utterly worn out, should, with business of such urgency, be standing over this dolt on whom his whole fate depended, while he snored as though there were nothing the matter, as though he'd dropped from another planet. "Oh, the irony of fate!" cried Mitya, and quite losing his head he fell again to rousing the tipsy peasant. He roused him with a sort of ferocity, pulled him, pushed him, even beat him. But after 5 minutes of vain exertions he returned to his bench in helpless despair and sat down. "Stupid! Stupid!" cried Mitya, "and how dishonourable it all is!" Something made him mad. His head began to ache horribly. Should he fling it up and go away altogether? He wondered. No, wait till tomorrow now, I'll stay on purpose. What else did I come for? Besides, I've no means of going. How am I to get away from here now? Oh, the idiocy of it! But his head ached more and more. He sat without moving and unconsciously dozed off and fell asleep as he sat. He seemed to have slept 2 hours or more. He was waked up by his head aching so unbearably that he could have screamed. There was a hammering in his temples and the top of his head ached. It was a long time before he could wake up fully and understand what had happened to him. At last he realized that the room was full of charcoal fumes from the stove, and that he might die of suffocation. And the drunken peasant still lay snoring. The candle guttered and was about to go out. Mitya cried out and ran staggering across the passage into the forester's room. The forester waked up at once, but hearing that the other room was full of fumes, to Mitya's surprise and annoyance accepted the fact with strange unconcern, though he did go to see to it. "But he's dead, and what am I to do then?" cried Mitya frantically. They threw open the doors, opened a window, and the chimney. Mitya brought a pail of water from the passage. First he wetted his own head, then finding a rag of some sort, dipped it into the water and put it on Lyagavy's head. The forester still treated the matter contemptuously, and when he opened the window said grumpily, "It'll be all right now." He went back to sleep, leaving Mitya a lighted lantern. Mitya fussed about the drunken peasant for half an hour, wetting his head, and gravely resolved not to sleep all night. But he was so worn out that when he sat down for a moment to take breath, he closed his eyes, unconsciously stretched himself full length on the bench, and slept like the dead. It was dreadfully late when he waked. It was somewhere about 9 o'clock. The sun was shining brightly in the 2 little windows of the hut. The curly-headed peasant was sitting on the bench and had his coat on. He had another samovar and another bottle in front of him. Yesterday's bottle had already been finished, and the new one was more than half empty. Mitya jumped up and saw at once that the cursed peasant was drunk again, hopelessly and incurably. He stared at him for a moment with wide-opened eyes. The peasant was silently and slyly watching him with insulting composure, and even a sort of contemptuous condescension, so Mitya fancied. He rushed up to him. "Excuse me, you see, you've most likely heard from the forester here in the hut. I'm Lieutenant Dmitri Karamazov, the son of the old Karamazov whose copse you're buying." "That's a lie," said the peasant, calmly and confidently. "A lie? You know Fyodor Pavlovitch?" "I don't know any of your Fyodor Pavlovitches," said the peasant, speaking thickly. "You're bargaining with him for the copse. Do wake up and collect yourself. Father Pavel of Ilyanskoye brought me here. You wrote to Samsonov, and he has sent me to you." Mitya gasped breathlessly. "You're lying." Lyagavy blurted out again. Mitya's legs went cold. "For mercy's sake, it isn't a joke. You're drunk, perhaps. Yet you can speak and understand, or else I understand nothing." "You're a painter." "For mercy's sake, I'm Karamazov, Dmitri Karamazov. I have an offer to make you, an advantageous offer, very advantageous offer concerning the copse." The peasant stroked his beard importantly. No, you've contracted for the job and turned out a scamp. You're a scoundrel."
"I assure you you're mistaken," cried Mitya, wringing his hands in despair. The peasant still stroked his beard and suddenly screwed up his eyes cunningly. "No, you show me this. You tell me the law that allows roguery. Do you hear? You're a scoundrel. Do you understand that?" Mitya stepped back gloomily, and suddenly something seemed to hit him on the head, as he said afterwards. In an instant a light seemed to dawn in his mind. A light was kindled, and I grasped it all. He stood stupefied, wondering how he, after all a man of intelligence, could have yielded to such folly, have been led into such an adventure, and have kept it up for almost 24 hours, fussing round this Liagavi, wetting his head. "Why, the man's dead drunk, and he'll go on drinking now for a week. What's the use of waiting here? And what if Samsonov sent me here on purpose? What if she— Oh, God, what have I done?" The peasant sat watching him and grinning. Another time Mitya might have killed the fool in a fury, but now he felt as weak as a child. He went quietly to the bench, took up his overcoat, put it on without a word, and went out of the hut. He did not find the forester in the next room. There was no one there. He took 50 kopecks in small change out of his pocket, and put them on the table for his night's lodging, the candle, and the trouble he had given. Coming out of the hut, he saw nothing but forest all round. He walked at hazard, not knowing which way to turn out of the hut, to the right or to the left. Hurrying there the evening before with the priest, he had not noticed the road. He had no revengeful feeling for anybody, not even Samsonov, in his heart. He strode along a narrow forest path, aimless, dazed, without heeding where he was going. A child could have knocked him down, so weak was he in body and soul. He got out of the forest somehow, however, and a vista of fields, bare after the harvest, stretched as far as the eye could see. "What despair! What death all round!" he repeated, striding on and on. He was saved by meeting an old merchant who was being driven across country in a hired trap. When he overtook him, Mitya asked the way, and it turned out that the old merchant, too, was going to Volovya. After some discussion, Mitya got into the trap. 3 hours later they arrived. At Volovya, Mitya at once ordered posting horses to drive to the town, and suddenly realized that he was appallingly hungry. While the horses were being harnessed, an omelette was prepared for him. He ate it all in an instant, ate a huge hunk of bread, ate a sausage, and swallowed 3 glasses of vodka. After eating, his spirits and his heart grew lighter. He flew towards the town, urged on the driver, and suddenly made a new and unalterable plan to procure that accursed money before evening. "And to think, only to think that a man's life should be ruined for the sake of that paltry 3,000, he cried contemptuously. "I'll settle it today." And if it had not been for the thought of Grushenka, and of what might have happened to her, which never left him, he would perhaps have become quite cheerful again. But the thought of her was stabbing him to the heart every moment, like a sharp knife. At last they arrived, and Mitya at once ran to Grushenka. Chapter 3. Gold Mines. This was the visit of Mitya, of which Grushenka had spoken to Rakitin with such horror. She was just then expecting the message, and was much relieved that Mitya had not been to see her that day or the day before. She hoped that, "Please God, he won't come till I'm gone away," and he suddenly burst in on her. The rest we know already. To get him off her hands, she suggested at once that he should walk with her to Samsonov's, where she said she absolutely must go to settle his accounts. And when Mitya accompanied her at once, she said good-bye to him at the gate, making him promise to come at 12 o'clock to take her home again. Mitya, too, was delighted at this arrangement. If she was sitting at Samsonov's, she could not be going to Fyodor Pavlovitch's. "If only she's not lying," he added at once. But he thought she was not lying from what he saw. He was that sort of jealous man who, in the absence of the beloved woman, at once invents all sorts of awful fancies of what may be happening to her, and how she may be betraying him,
But when shaken, heartbroken, convinced of her faithlessness, he runs back to her. At the first glance at her face, her gay, laughing, affectionate face, he revives at once, lays aside all suspicion, and with joyful shame abuses himself for his jealousy. After leaving Grushenka at the gate, he rushed home. Oh, he had so much still to do that day. But a load had been lifted from his heart, anyway. Now I must only make haste and find out from Smerdyakov whether anything happened there last night, whether by any chance she went to Fyodor Pavlovitch. Ugh! Floated through his mind. Before he had time to reach his lodging, jealousy had surged up again in his restless heart. Jealousy? Othello was not jealous, he was trustful, observed Pushkin, and that remark alone is enough to show the deep insight of our great poet. Othello's soul was shattered and his whole outlook clouded simply because his ideal was destroyed. But Othello did not begin hiding, spying, peeping. He was trustful. On the contrary, he had to be led up, pushed on, excited with great difficulty before he could entertain the idea of deceit. The truly jealous man is not like that. It is impossible to picture to oneself the shame and moral degradation to which the jealous man can descend without a qualm of conscience. And yet it's not as though the jealous were all vulgar and base souls. On the contrary, a man of lofty feelings, whose love is pure and full of self-sacrifice, may yet hide under tables, bribe the vilest people, and be familiar with the lowest ignominy of spying and eavesdropping. Othello was incapable of making up his mind to faithlessness, not incapable of forgiving it, but of making up his mind to it, though his soul was as innocent and free from malice as a babe's. It is not so with a really jealous man. It is hard to imagine what some jealous men can make up their mind to and overlook, and what they can forgive. The jealous are the readiest of all to forgive, and all women know it. The jealous man can forgive extraordinarily quickly, though of course after a violent scene, and he is able to forgive infidelity almost conclusively proved, the very kisses and embraces he has seen, if only he can somehow be convinced that it has all been for the last time, and that his rival will vanish from that day forward, will depart to the ends of the earth, or that he himself will carry her away somewhere where that dreaded rival will not get near her. Of course, the reconciliation is only for an hour, for, even if the rival did disappear next day, he would invent another one, and would be jealous of him. And one might wonder what there was in a love that had to be so watched over, what a love could be worth that needed such strenuous guarding. But that the jealous will never understand. And yet among them are men of noble hearts. It is remarkable, too, that those men of noble hearts, standing hidden in some cupboard, listening and spying, never feel the stings of conscience at that moment, anyway, though they understand clearly enough with their noble hearts the shameful depths to which they have voluntarily sunk. At the sight of Grushenka, Mitya's jealousy vanished, and for an instant he became trustful and generous, and positively despised himself for his evil feelings. But that only proved that, in his love for that woman, there was an element of something far higher than he himself imagined, that it was not only a sensual passion, not only the curve of her body, of which he had talked to Alyosha. But as soon as Grushenka had gone, Mitya began to suspect her of all the low cunning of faithlessness, and he felt no sting of conscience at it. And so jealousy surged up in him again. He had, in any case, to make haste. The first thing to be done was to get hold of at least a small temporary loan of money. The 9 roubles had almost all gone on his expedition, and, as we all know, one can't take a step without money. But he thought over in the cart where he could get a loan. He had a brace of fine duelling pistols in a case, which he'd not pawned till then, because he prized them above all his possessions. In the Metropolis Tavern he had some time since made acquaintance with a young official, and had learnt that this very opulent bachelor was passionately fond of weapons. He used to buy pistols, revolvers, daggers, hang them on his wall, and show them to acquaintances. He prided himself on them, and was quite a specialist on the mechanism of the revolver. Mitya, without stopping to think, went straight to him and offered to pawn his pistols to him for 10 roubles. The official, delighted, began trying to persuade him to sell them outright. But Mitya would not consent, so the young man gave him 10 roubles, protesting that nothing would induce him to take interest. They parted friends. Mitya was in haste. He rushed towards Fyodor Pavlovitch's by the back way, to his arbour, to get hold of Smerdyakov as soon as possible. In this way the fact was established that 3 or 4 hours before a certain event, of which I shall speak later on, Mitya had not a farthing, and pawned for 10 roubles a possession he valued, though 3 hours later he was in possession of thousands. But I am anticipating. From Maria Kondratyevna, the woman living near Fyodor Pavlovitch's, he learned the very disturbing fact of Smerdyakov's illness. He heard the story of his fall in the cellar, his fit, the doctor's visit, Fyodor Pavlovitch's anxiety. He heard with interest, too, that his brother Ivan had set off that morning for Moscow. "Then he must have driven through Volovya before me," thought Dmitri. But he was terribly distressed about Smerdyakov. "What will happen now? Who'll keep watch for me? Who'll bring me word?" he thought. He began greedily questioning the women whether they had seen anything the evening before. They quite understood what he was trying to find out, and completely reassured him. No one had been there. Ivan Fyodorovitch had been there the night. Everything had been perfectly as usual. Mitya grew thoughtful. He would certainly have to keep watch today, but where? Here, or at Samsonov's gate? He decided that he must be on the lookout both here and there, and meanwhile, the difficulty was that he had to carry out the new plan that he'd made on the journey back. He was sure of its success, but he must not delay acting upon it. Mitya resolved to sacrifice an hour to it. "In an hour I shall know everything. I shall settle everything, and then, first of all to Samsonov's. I'll inquire whether Grushenka's there, and instantly be back here again, stay till 11, and then to Samsonov's again to bring her home." This was what he decided. He flew home, washed, combed his hair, brushed his clothes, dressed, and went to Madame Holakov's. Alas, he had built his hopes on her. He had resolved to borrow 3,000 from that lady, and what was more, he felt suddenly convinced that she would not refuse to lend it to him. It may be wondered why, if he felt so certain, he'd not gone to her at first, one of his own sort, so to speak, instead of to Samsonov, a man he did not know, who was not of his own class, and to whom he hardly knew how to speak. But the fact was that he'd never known Madame Holikov well, and had seen nothing of her for the last month, and that he knew she could not endure him. She had detested him from the first because he was engaged to Katerina Ivanovna, while she had for some reason suddenly conceived the desire that Katerina Ivanovna should throw him over, and marry the charming, chivalrously refined Ivan, who had such excellent manners. Mitya's manners she detested. Mitya positively laughed at her, and at once said about her that she was just as lively and at her ease as she was uncultivated. But that morning in the cart a brilliant idea had struck him. If she's so anxious I should not marry Katerina Ivanovna, and he knew she was positively hysterical upon the subject, why should she refuse me now that 3,000 just to enable me to leave Katya and get away from her forever? These spoilt fine ladies, if they set their hearts on anything, will spare no expense to satisfy their caprice. Besides, she's so rich, Mitya argued. As for his plan, it was just the same as before. It consisted of the offer of his rights to Tchermashnya, but not with a commercial object, as it had been with Samsonov, not trying to allure the lady with the possibility of making a profit of 6,000 or 7,000, but simply as a security for the debt. As he worked out this new idea, Mitya was enchanted with it, But so it always was with him in all his undertakings, in all his sudden decisions. He gave himself up to every new idea with passionate enthusiasm. Yet when he mounted the steps of Madame Hohlakov's house, he felt a shiver of fear run down his spine. At that moment he saw fully, as a mathematical certainty, that this was his last hope, that if this broke down, nothing else was left him in the world but to rob and murder someone for the 3,000. It was 7:30 when he rang at the bell. At first, fortune seemed to smile upon him. As soon as he was announced, he was received with extraordinary rapidity. "As though she were waiting for me," thought Mitya, and as soon as he'd been led to the drawing-room, the lady of the house herself ran in and declared at once that she was expecting him. "I was expecting you, though I'd no reason to suppose you would come to see me, as you will admit yourself. Yet I did expect you. You may marvel at my instinct, Dmitri Fyodorovitch, but I was convinced all the morning that you would come." "That is certainly wonderful, madame," observed Mitya, sitting down limply. "But I've come to you on a matter of great importance, on a matter of supreme importance for me, that is, madame, for me alone, and I hasten—" "I know you've come on most important business, Dmitri Fyodorovitch. It's not a case of presentiment, no reactionary harking back to the miraculous. Have you heard about Father Zosima? This is a case of mathematics. You couldn't help coming, after all that has passed with Katerina Ivanovna. You couldn't, that's a mathematical certainty." "The realism of actual life, madame, that's what it is. But allow me to explain." "Realism indeed, Dmitri Fyodorovitch. I'm all for realism now. I've seen too much of miracles. You've heard that Father Zosima is dead?" "No, madame, it's the first time I've heard of it." Mitya was a little surprised. The image of Alyosha rose to his mind. "Last night, and only imagine—" "Madame," said Mitya, "I can imagine nothing except that I'm in a desperate position, and that if you don't help me, everything will come to grief, and I first of all. Excuse me for the triviality of the expression, but I'm in a fever." I know that you're in a fever. You could hardly fail to be, and whatever you may say to me, I know beforehand. I've been long thinking over your destiny, Dmitri Fyodorovitch. I am watching over it and studying it. Oh, believe me, I'm an experienced doctor of the soul, Dmitri Fyodorovitch. Madame, if you're an experienced doctor, I'm certainly an experienced patient," said Mitya with an effort to be polite, "and I feel that if you are watching over my destiny in this way, you will come to my help in my ruin. And so allow me at least to explain to you the plan with which I have ventured to come to you, and what I am hoping of you. I have come, madame—" "Don't explain it. It's of secondary importance. But as for help, you're not the first I've helped, Dmitri Fyodorovitch. You have most likely heard of my cousin, Madame Belmesov. Her husband was ruined, had come to grief, as you characteristically express it, Dmitri Fyodorovitch. I recommended him to take to horse-breeding, and now he's doing well. Have you any idea of horse-breeding, Dmitri Fyodorovitch?" "Not the faintest, madame. Ah, madame, not the faintest," cried Mitya in nervous impatience, positively starting from his seat. "I simply implore you, madame, to listen to me. Only give me 2 minutes of free speech that I may just explain to you everything, the whole plan with which I've come. Besides, I'm short of time. I'm in a fearful hurry," Mitya cried hysterically, feeling that she was just going to begin talking again, and hoping to cut her short. "I've come in despair, in the last gasp of despair, to beg you to lend me the sum of 3,000, alone, but on safe, most safe security, madame, with the most trustworthy guarantees. Only let me explain." "You must tell me all that afterwards." "Afterwards?" Madame Hohlakov with a gesture demanded silence in her turn. "And whatever you may tell me, I know it all beforehand. I've told you so already. You ask for a certain sum, for 3,000, but I can give you more, immeasurably more. I'll save you, Dmitri Fyodorovitch, but you must listen to me." Mitya started from his seat again. "Madame, will you really be so good?" he cried with a strong feeling. "Good God, you've saved me. You've saved a man from a violent death, from a bullet. My eternal gratitude." "I will give you more, infinitely more than 3,000, cried Madame Hohlakov, looking with a radiant smile at Mitya's ecstasy. "Infinitely? But I don't need so much. I only need that fatal 3,000, and on my part I can give security for that sum with infinite gratitude, and I propose a plan which—" "Enough, Dmitri Fyodorovitch, it's said and done." Madame Hohlakov cut him short, with the modest triumph of beneficence.
I promised to save you, and I will save you. I will save you as I did Belmesov. What do you think of the gold mines, Dmitri Fyodorovitch?" "Of the gold mines, madame? I've never thought anything about them." "But I've thought of them for you, thought of them over and over again. I've been watching you for the last month. I've watched you 100 times as you've walked past, saying to myself, that's a man of energy who ought to be at the gold mines. I've studied your gait, and come to the conclusion that's a man who would find gold." "From my gait, madame?" said Mitya, smiling. "Yes, from your gait. You surely don't deny that character can be told from the gait, Dmitri Fyodorovitch? Science supports the idea. I'm all for science and realism now. After all this business with Father Zosima, which has so upset me, from this very day I'm a realist, and I want to devote myself to practical usefulness. I'm cured. Enough, as Turgenev says. But, madame, the 3,000 you so generously promised to lend me, it is yours, Dmitri Fyodorovitch." Madame Hohlakov cut in at once. "The money is as good as in your pocket. Not 3,000, but 3,000,000, Dmitri Fyodorovitch, in less than no time. I'll make you a present of the idea. You shall find gold mines, make millions, return, and become a leading man, and wake us up and lead us to better things. Are we to leave it all to the Jews? You will find institutions and enterprises of all sorts. You will help the poor, and they will bless you. This is the age of railways, Dmitri Fyodorovitch. You'll become famous and indispensable to the Department of Finance, which is so badly off at present. The depreciation of the rouble keeps me awake at night, Dmitri Fyodorovitch. People don't know that side of me. Madame, Dmitri interrupted with an uneasy presentiment. I shall indeed perhaps follow your advice, your wise advice, madame. I shall perhaps set off to the gold mines. I'll come and see you again about it. Many times, indeed. But now, that 3,000 you so generously... Oh, that would set me free, and if you could today... You see, I haven't a minute to lose today. Enough, Dmitri Fyodorovitch, enough. Madame Hohlakov interrupted emphatically. The question is, will you go to the gold mines or not? Have you quite made up your mind? Answer yes or no. I will go, madame, afterwards. I'll go where you like. But now... Wait, cried Madame Hohlakov, and jumping up and running to a handsome bureau with numerous little drawers, she began pulling out one drawer after another, looking for something with desperate haste. The 3,000, thought Mitya, his heart almost stopping, and at the instant, without any papers or formalities. That's doing things in gentlemanly style. She's a splendid woman, if only she didn't talk so much. Here, cried Madame Hohlakov, running back joyfully to Mitya. Here's what I was looking for. It was a tiny silver icon on a cord, such as is sometimes worn next the skin with a cross. This is from Kiev, Dmitri Fyodorovitch, she went on reverently, from the relics of the Holy Martyr Varvara. Let me put it on your neck myself, and with it dedicate you to a new life, to a new career. And she actually put the cord round his neck, and began arranging it. In extreme embarrassment, Mitya bent down and helped her, and at last he got it under his necktie and collar, through his shirt to his chest. Now you can set off, Madame Hohlakov pronounced, sitting down triumphantly in her place again. Madame, I'm so touched. I don't know how to thank you, indeed, for such kindness, but if you only knew how precious time is to me, that sum of money for which I shall be indebted to your generosity. Oh, madame, since you are so kind, so touchingly generous to me, Mitya exclaimed impulsively, then let me reveal to you, though of course you've known it a long time, that I love somebody here. I have been forced to Katerina Ivanovna, I should say. Oh, I've behaved inhumanly, dishonourably to her, but I fell in love here with another woman, a woman whom you, madame, perhaps despise, for you know everything already, but whom I cannot leave on any account, and therefore that 3,000 now—" "Leave everything, Dmitri Fyodorovitch," Madame Hohlakov interrupted in the most decisive tone. "Leave everything, especially women. Gold mines are your goal, and there's no place for women there. Afterwards, when you come back rich and famous, you'll find the girl of your heart in the highest society. That will be a modern girl, a girl of education and advanced ideas. By that time the dawning woman question will have gained ground, and the new woman will have appeared. Madame, that's not the point, not at all. Mitya clasped his hands in entreaty. Yes, it is, Dmitri Fyodorovitch, just what you need, the very thing you're yearning for, though you don't realize it yourself. I'm not at all opposed to the present woman movement, Dmitri Fyodorovitch. The development of woman, and even the political emancipation of women in the near future, that's my ideal. I've a daughter myself, Dmitri Fyodorovitch. People don't know that side of me. I wrote a letter to the author, Shchedrin, on that subject. He's taught me so much about the vocation of women. So last year I sent him an anonymous letter of 2 lines. I kiss and embrace you, my teacher, for the modern woman. Persevere. And I signed myself a mother. I thought of signing myself a contemporary mother, and hesitated, but I stuck to the simple mother. There's more moral beauty in that, Dmitri Fyodorovitch, and the word contemporary might have reminded him of the contemporary, a painful recollection owing to the censorship. Good heavens, what is the matter? Madame, cried Mitya, jumping up at last, clasping his hands before her in helpless entreaty, you will make me weep if you delay what you have so generously. Oh, do weep, Dmitri Fyodorovitch, do weep. That's a noble feeling. Such a path lies open before you. Tears will ease your heart. Later on you will return rejoicing. You will hasten to me from Siberia on purpose to share your joy with me. But allow me, too, Mitya cried suddenly. For the last time I entreat you, tell me, can I have the sum you promised me today? If not, when may I come for it? What sum, Dmitri Fyodorovitch? The 3,000 you promised me, that you so generously— 3,000 roubles? Oh, no, I haven't got 3,000, Madame Hohlakov announced with serene amazement. Mitya was stupefied. Why, you said just now, you said it was as good as in my hands. Oh, no, you misunderstand me, Dmitri Fyodorovitch. In that case you misunderstood me. I was talking of the gold mines. It's true I promised you more, infinitely more than 3,000. I remember it all now. But I was referring to the gold mines. But the money, the 3,000, Mitya exclaimed awkwardly. Oh, if you meant money, I haven't any. I haven't a penny, Dmitri Fyodorovitch. I'm quarrelling with my steward about it, and I've just borrowed 500 roubles from Musov myself. No, I've no money. And do you know, Dmitri Fyodorovitch, if I had, I wouldn't give it to you. In the first place, I never lend money. Lending money means losing friends. I wouldn't give it to you particularly. I wouldn't give it to you because I like you and want to save you. For all you need is the gold mines. The gold mines, the gold mines. Oh, the devil, roared Mitya, and with all his might brought his fist down on the table. Aye, cried Madame Hohlakov, alarmed, and she flew to the other end of the drawing-room. Mitya spat on the ground and strode rapidly out of the room, out of the house, into the street, into the darkness. He walked like one possessed, and beating himself on the breast, on the spot where he'd struck himself 2 days previously, before Alyosha, the last time he saw him in the dark, on the road. What those blows upon his breast signified, on that spot, and what he meant by it, that was for the time a secret which was known to no one in the world, and had not been told even to Alyosha. But that secret meant for him more than disgrace. It meant ruin, suicide. So he had determined, if he did not get hold of the 3,000 that would pay his debt to Katerina Ivanovna, and so remove from his breast, from that spot on his breast, the shame he carried upon it, that weighed on his conscience. All this will be fully explained to the reader later on, but now that his last hope had vanished, this man, so strong in appearance, burst out crying like a little child a few steps from the Hohlakovs' house. He walked on, and, not knowing what he was doing, wiped away his tears with his fist. In this way he reached the square, and suddenly became aware that he'd stumbled against something. He heard a piercing wail from an old woman whom he'd almost knocked down. "Good Lord, you've nearly killed me. Why don't you look where you're going, scapegrace?" "Why, it's you!" cried Mitya, recognizing the old woman in the dark. It was the old servant who waited on Samsonov, whom Mitya had particularly noticed the day before. "And who are you, my good sir?" said the old woman in quite a different voice. I don't know you in the dark. You live at Kuzma Kuzmich's. You're the servant there?" "Just so, sir. I was only running out to Prohorich's, but I don't know you now. Tell me, my good woman, is Agrafena Alexandrovna there now?" said Mitya, beside himself with suspense. "I saw her to the house some time ago." "She has been there, sir. She stayed a little while and went off again." "What? Went away?" cried Mitya. "When did she go?" "Why, as soon as she came. She only stayed a minute. She only told Kuzma Kuzmich a tale that made him laugh, and then she ran away." "You're lying, damn you!" roared Mitya. "Ai, ai!" shrieked the old woman. But Mitya had vanished. He ran with all his might to the house where Grushenka lived. At the moment he reached it, Grushenka was on her way to Mokroe. It was not more than a quarter of an hour after her departure. Fenya was sitting with her grandmother, the old cook, Matryona, in the kitchen when the captain ran in. Fenya uttered a piercing shriek on seeing him. "You scream!" roared Mitya. "Where is she?" But without giving the terror-stricken Fenya time to utter a word, he fell all of a heap at her feet. "Fenya, for Christ's sake, tell me, where is she?" "I don't know, Dmitri Fyodorovitch, my dear. I don't know. You may kill me, but I can't tell you." Fenya swore and protested. "You went out with her yourself not long ago. She came back." "Indeed she didn't. By God, I swear she didn't come back." "You're lying," shouted Mitya. "From your terror I know where she is." He rushed away. Fenya, in her fright, was glad she'd got off so easily, but she knew very well that it was only that he was in such haste, or she might not have fared so well. But as he ran, he surprised both Fenya and old Matryona by an unexpected action. On the table stood a brass mortar with a pestle in it, a small brass pestle, not much more than 6 inches long. Mitya already had opened the door with one hand when, with the other, he snatched up the pestle and thrust it in his side pocket. "Oh, Lord, he's going to murder someone!" cried Fenya, flinging up her hands.